meeting of the Endicott Village Board.
And good evening, I'm Steve Craig, News Channel 34. Tonight is the big night in Endicott when village trustees and residents get to ask IBM and state health and environmental officials questions about the plume of industrial solvents contaminating groundwater beneath dozens of acres of the village. More specifically, people have questions about solvent vapors that in some cases are making their way up through the soil and into homes and businesses. This is all happening in the auditorium at Union Endicott High School during a special village board meeting. This is the agenda as we have it as of this afternoon. The mayor will open the meeting, Mayor Michael Colella. It's expected then that a couple of officials from IBM will begin with a PowerPoint presentation. That's sort of an electronic slideshow giving IBM's side of the story. Could last over a half an hour, followed by presentations by the State Health Department and the State Department of Environmental Conservation. Both have a role here because the spill that we're talking about that precipitated a lot of the investigation that led to the discovery of the underground groundwater plume really started back in 1979 when IBM Endicott released some chemicals up in Endicott, and the DEC got involved and helped them define exactly how that situation would be managed. After that point, there has been monitoring going on all these years. Most people forgot all about the initial incident back in '79. They were reminded of that when they got in the mail back in November or December of last year letters from IBM stating that their businesses or their homes lie on ground over top of this groundwater plume. It's contaminated by a whole witch's brew of industrial solvents going back at least to that 1979 spill, some even further, and possibly some have been added after that. There's a big question about exactly who is responsible for which of the chemical constituents that underlie this 55-acre tract or even larger tract of Endicott. We can show you a picture of what's happening in Endicott right now. This is the auditorium at UE High School. We don't have any audio yet. We're still working on getting audio from the UE auditorium. There you see some of the participants in the meeting. The big blue screen there is where the PowerPoint presentation will be given by IBM. This is the case IBM is expected to make. IBM, of course, a long history in the village, the employer of thousands of people over the years. IBM pulled out of here just about lock, stock, and barrel within the last few years after a series of downsizing. So the affection in the village for IBM isn't what it once was. All right, we're going to take a look now at what we're seeing and hearing from IBM. Let me just say that IBM kind of underestimated what people's reaction would be when they got those letters back in November and December of last year. The letters told people that they would have their inside, they would have their air tested inside, and they also were told that there would be remediation following. And people kind of took it the wrong way. They didn't embrace the IBM solution as IBM thought they might. Well, this meeting is kind of an answer to that. IBM reaching out to present its side of why this is necessary, what has led to this point, and we're going to join now the meeting in progress of the IBM meeting with the Endicott Village Board.
With IBM, Don Carr, Craig Robertson, who is with Ground Science Corporation. Dan Garrity? I'm sorry. Dan Garrity with the Department of Health. Carolina Shabses, who is with the Department of Health. Tom Johnson, also with the Department of Health. Other participants, I'm not sure of their names. Denise Radke, right. With the DEC. Both of you are with the Department of Environmental. You're with Broome County Department of Health. You are with Department of Environmental Conservation. I'm sorry I don't have this because we didn't know right up to the beginning of the meeting who was going to be representing.
I'm Bill Wirtz with New York State DEC.
Bill Wirtz with New York State DEC.
All right, the man at the podium now is Endicott Mayor Michael Colella, and he's going through the roster of those who will be participating in the meeting tonight.
Who directly supervises the water department in the village of Endicott, and Mr. Bruce Myers, who is our clerk treasurer. Amy Eldred, who has helped endeavor to set up this meeting. there, we will follow the agenda with the changes I've made. When we get to the public participation, and we welcome the public to participate, and we have from the beginning. In fact, IBM has asked us to do that. Due to the number of people here this evening, we will ask you, when it comes to the visitor participation, that you come forward. We will move the microphone out into the aisle, give your name and address for the record and the rest of the people present. You will be allowed one question, and I'd like to limit the time, if I can, to about 2 minutes because there's so many people here, and we'd ask you to come up only once unless very few people come up, and then we can go back through the audience again. The public may ask any participant here this evening to answer your questions. If you require more time and would like to speak personally with these people, they will be available tomorrow afternoon from 2 to 8 in the UE High School cafeteria. I would ask you, please, since this is coming up into political season, to not make this political and to respect, please, all the participants in the audience here tonight. And I will be the final judge of the appropriateness of the questions, and I may call you out of order if it is necessary, and I don't think that will be necessary. So we will go on with the presentation from International Business Machine Corporation. And the opening remarks are going to be by Wayne Balta. Wayne.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mayor Colella. Good evening. Good evening, Mayor. Good evening, trustees of the Village of Endicott. Good evening to all of you, the people of this village and the people of this area. My name is Wayne Balta. I work at IBM, and at IBM, my responsibility is as Vice President of Corporate Environmental Affairs and Product Safety. In that role, I'm the guy who has direct personal responsibility for the performance of the groundwater vapor project here in Endicott and for the performance of continued groundwater remediation here in Endicott. The origin of tonight's meeting is somewhat as the mayor described. In essence, we at IBM wanted to be responsive to the interest from the mayor and the trustees for a meeting at which the mayor and trustees could hear firsthand from IBM about the groundwater vapor project. We have also heard, and we have heard loud and clear from many of you, that you want to know more about this project from IBM. We've gotten that message, and so for that very reason, we are here tonight. My colleagues are here with me, and our intention is to provide the mayor, trustees, and all of you with an update about this vapor project, groundwater remediation, and to answer all of your questions. I know that many of you have concerns. I know you have concerns about this project, about your family, about your health. I understand you have concerns about your properties, and in fact, concerns about your community at large. And I want you to know that I am very sorry that you have to face these concerns. We hope that by providing factual and accurate information to you, that you will be helped with the concerns that you are facing. We have a corresponding agenda tonight to try to do that. Our agenda includes a couple of presentations and then ample time for questions from the mayor, the trustees, and from you. We will keep the presentations as short and direct as we can, while at the same time providing you with information that is important and that will help you further understand exactly what is happening. We're pretty certain that tonight's speakers will address many of your questions, but once again, we will be pleased at the end of the presentations to address your questions from the floor. And I want you to know that I will stay up tonight as late as I can physically stay awake to address all of the questions you have personally. So please let me first describe what we have for the evening's agenda. Following me, you'll hear from Mitch Myers. Mitch Myers is this fellow right over here to my right. Mitch is IBM's project manager for this work. And many of you may have met Mitch over the last 6 months in his role as project manager. Mitch will speak and will provide information to you that fundamentally should help enable everyone here tonight to have at least the same level of understanding about what IBM is doing and why IBM is doing it. Beyond Mitch, we have officials from the State Department of Environmental Conservation, as well as from the State Department of Health. And they're also on the agenda tonight to speak with you. Again, following the presentations, all of us will be together here up front to address to the best of our ability your questions. Now, in addition to those speaking tonight, we have a few more folks from IBM and from other companies, and I'd like to tell you who they are so you can know them and identify them. Among them are Kevin Whalen. Kevin is sitting here in the front. Why don't you stand just so people can see you, Kevin? Kevin is IBM's assistant project manager for this work. Like Mitch, many of you may have met Kevin. I'm aware that he has been in many of your homes. He has talked to many of you in person. You may have met him at some of the prior public availability sessions. In addition to Kevin, next door is Miss Idan Dion. Idan works at IBM as the company's Director of Corporate Environmental Affairs. Some of you might have met Idan at the last public availability session. Beyond Idan, as the mayor has already mentioned, we have with us Paul Sanborn. Paul is over here. Paul Sanborn is president of Sanborn Head and Associates. Next to Paul is Dan Carr. Dan is vice president of Sanborn Head and Associates. Sanborn Head and Associates is the external engineering firm which IBM hired to help us with the groundwater vapor project. And these are the principals that run the company and are here tonight also to help address questions you may have. In addition to the gentleman from Sanborn Head, we have next to them Craig Robertson. Craig is the president of Groundwater Sciences. Groundwater Sciences is the firm that IBM has hired to help us with the ongoing control and remediation of contaminated groundwater. So that's in essence many of the people who are here who will help answer questions. In addition, there's a face tonight that should be familiar to many of you. That's Mrs. Diana Benz. Diana Benz is over here, front and center, and many of you may recognize Diana as IBM's senior location executive here in Endicott for many years. Now that I've told you who is here from IBM, I'd also like to tell you who is not here from IBM. There is not one single IBM lawyer present in this room tonight. There are no outside counsel representing IBM here at this meeting tonight. And the reason for that is simple. The reason is because we are not here to cast blame, to interrogate, to cross-examine, or to conduct a mock court trial. Rather, the reason we are here is straightforward, to provide all of you with straight, accurate information in a constructive manner that we hope and believe will be very helpful to you in understanding what is happening going forward. Now, in that regard, we have noticed in recent weeks that some have formed the impression that IBM is at odds with the community. IBM does not want to be at odds with you and this fine community. So therefore, I'd like to personally assure you of three things. And if there can only be three things that you would remember from the meeting tonight, I would ask you to consider these three things. Number one, IBM still cares very deeply about this community. And the manner in which IBM is performing the groundwater vapor project is consistent with priorities and that very care. Number two, IBM is not and will not walk away from the groundwater vapor project or the continued remediation of contaminated groundwater in the village of Endicott. And number three, we recognize that we at IBM need to communicate more effectively with you than we have so far, and we intend to do exactly that. Tomorrow, we are having a 6-hour open house at which all of you are welcome to come, address questions you may have in further detail. And going forward, we will have such open houses more frequently. We also tonight have additional information to provide to you by means of a handout. We will provide you tonight with three documents. One will be a map of soil gas concentrations in the project area. The other will be a map showing contours of groundwater contamination in the project area. And the third will be a handout of every single piece of data from indoor air sampling since the inception of this project. Those three handouts will be available for you tonight as you leave the meeting. Now, there are several important things that we believe all of us need to understand about the project, and I'd like to explain them to you. First is that although IBM has indeed been conducting the remediation of contaminated groundwater here in the village of Endicott since 1979, the concept of groundwater vapor intrusion is a newly recognized phenomenon. We defined the boundary of the groundwater vapor project based on data from the groundwater remediation and other engineering factors. We divided the project into a couple of areas. We divided it into a core area and into an extended area. And that division was based on the data that indicated to us where the likeliest impact of this phenomena would be. We wanted to start at the place where we thought the impact was most likely. That's why we divided it into a core area and then an extended area. We are sampling air inside, outside, and underneath of properties for 11 specific chemicals. Now, why 11? The reason we're sampling for the 11 specific chemicals is because those are the exact 11 chemicals that have been historically detected in groundwater in the village of Endicott. The next thing that's important to realize is that there are no national standards that define permissible levels of these chemicals in residential indoor air. And consequently, there are no national criteria and no national regulations which define when one must ventilate indoor air when any of these chemicals happen to be detected. For that reason, because there is no national standard for permissible levels and because there are no national criteria for when one must ventilate, the state of New York had to, for this specific project, define those very criteria. So the state could not say, here are the federal criteria that apply. The state was in a situation of saying, these are the criteria that shall apply to this project. Now, criteria were selected for this project, of course, and the criteria chosen call for ventilation if any of the 11 chemicals can be detected in any amount whatsoever by today's modern laboratory technology, and if their detection can be affiliated with groundwater. Again, the criteria call for ventilation if any of the 11 chemicals can be detected in any amount. So what amount can be detected? Well, the amount that can be detected by today's laboratory equipment consistently is very small. The number happens to be 0.22 micrograms per cubic meter. What is a microgram per cubic meter. It's very hard to understand for people who aren't used to having to deal with this kind of information. We'd like to try to be helpful. 0.22 micrograms is less than 1/billionth of a pound. Okay, 0.22 micrograms is less than 1/billionth of a pound. And 0.22 micrograms per cubic meter is similar to 1 grain of sand among 1 trillion grains of sand. Now, what that tells us is that today's modern laboratory detection technology can detect extraordinarily small amounts of these chemical substances. So if we detect this amount or more of any of the 11 chemicals, and if their existence is reasonably associated with groundwater, then we offer to ventilate, because that is the project criteria. Ventilating, if anything can be detected, is the most conservative criterion that could have been applied to this project. And based on this, to date, we have offered ventilation systems at 480 properties. We believe, and NYSDEC, the State of New York Department of Environmental Conservation, agrees that in the first 4 months of this year, as we have sampled through the winter heating season, we have identified 85% to 95% of the places where ventilation is appropriate. Finally, let me say that we have in place a 40 to 50 person team that is working hard to design and install ventilation systems, starting with the locations of highest priority. Okay. Now, those are some of the fundamental elements about the project that give all of us the same level of understanding as to how it came to be, what the criteria are, what we're doing, and where we're ventilating. I also recognize that there have been several concerns that many of you have had, and I'd like to speak with you about at least 6 of them. First, there has been a concern about the boundary of the project area. What's the boundary of this thing? How do you know what the boundary is? How do you determine that? What is the boundary? Okay, we recognize that that's a concern, and we've been working through it. Now that we've identified 85 to 95% of the places eligible for ventilation, and now that we're actively installing ventilation systems, our next priority is to sample around the edge of the project area during this coming heating season, so that we can be completely sure that we have, in fact, completely defined the boundary. Now, please understand that it is likely that we will need from November through April, which is this coming heating season, to undertake and complete this sampling around the edge. And for perspective, please also keep in mind that the edge is the location where we would expect concentrations to be lowest. I want you to know that we have not determined the places on the edge that will be sampled for this. We have not yet determined the places around the edge that we will sample. Now, the reason I tell you that is because I want you to understand and know that there isn't yet a list prepared that you have to worry about being on or off. If you are in a property on the edge, and if you would like to be sampled, we welcome and ask that you contact us and tell us that. Using the project's 888 toll-free number is fine. Telling one of us personally tonight is fine. Telling us through the open house tomorrow is fine. Under our work plan with the state, we do indeed need to completely define the project boundary, and we will not exclude sampling at any legitimate points that are on the edge. Now, another concern that has arisen regards sampling on the interior of the project area, inside the project area. Okay. We have worked as best we can, hard and diligently, to identify the places eligible for ventilation, and to do that as soon as we possibly could. When our data indicated that there was a likely need for ventilation at a place we did not sample, we went ahead and offered the ventilation system without waiting or delaying for a sample. We think this has been the right priority. However, I want you to know that if you are within the project area, and you're going to see a map that defines what the project area is, if you are within it, in the inside, and you have not been sampled, but you'd like to be, we will sit down with you, one-on-one. We will show you the data we have. We will explain it to you to the best of our ability. And if during or after that, you still would like to be sampled, we will agree to sample your property. We will agree to sample your property. But it's important to understand that this would occur after we complete the sampling, which is a higher priority, around the edge of the project, and may extend beyond the next heating season. The priority for us is to get the edge completely defined beyond the 85 to 95% that we have now. And we will certainly consider and do all the sampling that you may wish within the project boundary once that higher priority has been fulfilled. A third concern that we've been aware of has to do with a perception over whether the project area is growing. The area related to the groundwater plumes we're remediating, it's not growing. We purposefully divided the project, as I said, into a core area and an extended area. And the extended area had 3 phases. The reason we did this was simply to make it practical to undertake the work. We had to start somewhere. We wanted to start with the area of likely highest priority. We collected samples in one area and communicated the results to you as soon as we could, while continuing to collect samples in other areas and communicating them as soon as we could. But that doesn't mean that the project area grew in size. Okay, the area stayed the same. What emerged over time was the availability of sampling results from within that overall area. A fourth concern has regarded disclosure of indoor air sampling results. We are disclosing all indoor air sampling results as soon as practical. We disclosed results for the core area in its entirety back in March. Tonight, as I mentioned, we have all of the indoor air data for the entire project area throughout all of the extended study area and are making it available to you. Now, please understand that in disclosing this data, we are not identifying the specific property from which individual pieces of data come. And the reason we're not doing that is in order to respect the privacy of the property owner. The property owners are very clearly free to do as they see fit in terms of disclosing data for the property they own. It's simply not IBM's decision to make for them. Now, I want you to know that if...
Please, sir.
If all property owners wish to disclose their data, it is absolutely, positively okay with IBM. Absolutely fine. All we're saying is that the decision to do that is the prerogative of the individual property owner, not ours at IBM. We have absolutely no difficulty whatsoever if 100% of the property owners want to share their data. None at all. Fifth, the South Street wells.
Sir. Excuse me. Sir, you will have time to ask your questions, make your comments at the end of the presentation. Please bear with us.
We will be here to address your question, I promise you that. We will be here to address it. We will. Fifth is the South Street wells. There has been a concern that the groundwater contamination IBM has been addressing has impacted the South Street drinking water wells. Please let me tell you that the groundwater plumes IBM has been remediating are not affecting the South Street drinking water wells. We have ample data that demonstrates that. Data have been publicly available. We have always worked hard to prevent that from happening, and we've clearly succeeded at that. The groundwater plumes we are remediating have not affected the South Street drinking water wells. And then sixth concern that we have recently become aware of concerns this very high school we're meeting in tonight. This high school is outside of the project area, and the data we have indicate that it would not be affected by the groundwater plumes we're remediating. Nevertheless, we have seen the school board's deliberations over this question of sampling the high school. We have recognized that the school board has decided to sample here in the high school. Recognizing that the school is on an extremely tight timetable, not only to sample, but also to analyze the results, and recognizing that we at IBM are perhaps uniquely situated with the unique ability to get this done more quickly than anybody else, we have offered to the school to perform the sampling. And we have made clear that this offer should include having the school include an objective party to make sure that the way in which it's done is indeed objective. Now, in making this offer, I also want to say that we have advised the school that there are likely to be sources of some of these chemicals here in this school. There may be sources of some chemicals just outside the school. We only say this for the purpose of helping, to whatever extent we can, to minimize potential surprise if in fact the results come back positive, showing some amount of chemicals. We made this offer in the same way we have offered to ventilate certain properties within the project area where the source of indoor air material is obviously different and not associated with IBM. So that's some of the essential project information I wanted to communicate with you tonight. Once again, we have handouts which consist of new information for you. Once again, we are open to meeting your sampling interests, and we're willing to do that, but you'll need to recognize we're going to work in a manner that keeps highest priorities first. Now, I realized I've covered a lot of information in these few minutes I've spoken with you. But if there are 3 things that you could remember after you go home tonight, I would ask you to consider these. Number 1, IBM still does care very deeply about this community, and we are executing this project with priorities that reflect that care. Number 2, IBM is not walking away from groundwater vapor intrusion project or from the remediation of contaminated groundwater here in the village of Endicott. And number 3, we recognize we have a need to communicate with you more effectively than we have done so to date, and we intend to do exactly that. Okay, now that completes the information I wanted to share with you. As the agenda calls for, the next item is for Mitch Myers, our project manager, to provide you with additional information about the...
All right, as Wayne Walter wraps up, he did make one other comment that was pretty interesting. He said that among those who are not here are outside counsel, meaning lawyers from outside the area. The last time there was a big meeting in this auditorium, there were lawyers brought into the area by the local firm Levine, Goulden & Thompson to sign up clients to sue IBM. And that was clearly a pointed reference to that last meeting. Wayne Balta saying that IBM is not in the business of pointing fingers and not trying to share the blame here. IBM not walking away, continues to care deeply about Endicott, and that IBM is sorry that people in Endicott have to face what they're facing now.
In a variety of capacities and including here at the plant in Endicott for a number of years. As part of my responsibilities with the groundwater vapor project, I manage a team that's comprised of over 100 individuals that are contributing to the project. Not to confuse you, Wayne mentioned earlier that there are 40 to 50 people here working each and every day on the ventilation parts of that project. There are other folks behind the scenes working with us each and every day to collect data, analyze data, report, and that kind of thing. So we have a very large, capable team assembled. We have brought together, as Wayne introduced to you, our consultants, who are the very best people that we have found to assist us in the conduct of this project. I would like to walk through with you this evening just some background information about, at a fairly high level, about groundwater condition at the plant, kind of move to the groundwater vapor project and give you an overview of that and how we've gone about that project. I would also like to then go through the action plan, how it was developed, and some information that led to some decisions that were contained in there. I would also like to give you a status on the installation of the ventilation systems, and then also just give you some information kind of looking forward where we're going with the project. I will try to make this brief and at a fairly high level, and we can certainly get into some more of this detail when we get to the question and answer periods. With that, let me just say by way of background that in 1978, the IBM company recognized that this thing called groundwater contamination was possible at our plant sites, and there was an initiative announced throughout the corporation, including here in Endicott, to understand if, in fact, there was this thing called groundwater contamination present. And that initiative was underway here in Endicott at the time that the '79 spill occurred that we've all read about. And shortly after that '79 spill, obviously the investigations continued on a broad scale to understand where groundwater contamination existed, and then ultimately to design and install remediation systems to begin the cleanup of that contamination. That work has continued through time and has resulted in the installation of a number of groundwater extraction and treatment systems. Along with that process, we installed a number of groundwater monitoring wells. Some of those are visible to you as you drive around the village. There's some 200 of those wells out there that we continue to monitor today. It's through the monitoring of those wells that we know where the contamination is, and we can confirm that we are we're containing and making progress. Concerning the groundwater vapor aspect of this, the groundwater vapor, our awareness and understanding, of groundwater vapor is a phenomenon that's fairly new. And that's evidenced by the fact that EPA issued their first draft guidance for vapor intrusion in October of 2001. Our efforts here at the plant site concerning groundwater vapor began in May of 2002. That activity involved the sampling of soil gas on the plant site to see if this material was present, if this phenomenon that we had been reading about was occurring. IBM initiated this as one of 1,700 sites that EPA had identified to be evaluated for groundwater vapor intrusion. The results of our work that were begun at that time were summarized in a report in September of that same year and filed with the New York State. The conclusion from that report and the recommendation from that report made by IBM was that an indoor air testing program be initiated based on the results that we had seen on our plant site. New York State reviewed that recommendation, agreed with that recommendation, and that that resulted in a very prompt preparation of an action plan to conduct testing off the plant site. The Groundwater Vapor Project Action Plan is how we refer to that document. That document was presented at our public availability session in November of last year. It was approved by the state in December of last year. Some of the components of that action plan involved initially the testing of groundwater vapors, what we call foundation depth groundwater vapor sampling across a wide area throughout the village. That work was done initially to identify where vapors may be present, to assist us in defining the area that we should investigate, and to help us prioritize the work going forward. And we have an illustration of the outcome of that work, and as Wayne alluded to, we have we identified the study area. We identified the study area, which is in red. These would be the boundary areas. Oh, you can take, thank you. The red would be the boundary areas of the study area. And then, as we said earlier, with the study area is divided into different sections, this being the core area here, which was the area that we tested first. Then we called it, the remainder of the highlighted areas were the extended area, which were subdivided into 3 separate phases. The phase 1 area is this shading in here. Phase 2 area was this shading down in here. And phase 3 area was this eastern area here and this western area over here. We have completed that investigation work at this point. The results of that work, or what Wayne mentioned earlier, are going to be available tonight. And as a result of that work, we've determined where ventilation systems should be offered, and those results have been fed back to the people that allowed us to come in and take samples on their property, and we have offered ventilation where IBM and the state have reviewed and determined that it's appropriate. The result of the ventilation area, we have another chart for that, is also highlighted here in red. And the shaded area is where we have offered to ventilate. There are 380 structures in there where we have offered to ventilate. From a percentage standpoint, that represents about 47% of the entire study area has been offered ventilation. And I will stress again, as Wayne did, that we will be doing testing in the coming heating season to verify the boundary areas that have been identified. That testing will be more intensive in terms of spacing than we did in the earlier part of the study. Because we're now in the area, we want to be sure that we have those lines drawn in the proper locations, and that the homes that require ventilation, homes or other structures that require ventilation, are in fact ventilated. By way of status of ventilation, as I mentioned, we have 40 to 50 people working each and every day designing and installing ventilation systems. They're comprised of 4 design teams that make visits to design the ventilation systems, and we have 5 teams that are installing ventilation systems. At the present time, we have designed 250 systems, and we have installed approximately 150 systems. We continue, as I said, to add to those numbers each and every day. In terms of the project going forward, we have 4 activities that we're focusing on at this time. One is to obviously continue the installation of ventilation systems as quickly as we can. The second is to conduct the boundary testing that we've already described to you. The third is to conduct additional groundwater work, some of which is already underway. This is studies that we're conducting to evaluate whether there are other techniques and methodologies that could help accelerate the cleanup of groundwater. And that work, as I said, is underway and is expected to be completed by the end of the year. So those are the activities that we're currently focused on. and striving to
What
complete.
Mitch Myers is talking about here is something that Mike Nurchie, who is the village's environmental consultant, has been asking for, and that is a more modern system to get the vapors out of the groundwater before they get right beneath people's houses, something called a dual-phase vapor extraction program from groundwater. IBM's position on that tentatively is that it would require so much suction to do that far upstream from where they're detecting these vapors in people's houses that it would not be practical, and that this distributed form of remediation, of getting the groundwater vapors out right as they enter the house, is more practical. But IBM is committed to investigating that, and Mike Nurchie, the village's engineer, has been asking about that for quite some time now. Next, we're going to be hearing from one of the regulators who has been overseeing the groundwater remediation project for more than 20 years now. He's from the DEC, and his name is Bill Wirtz. The DEC obviously working hand in hand with IBM on the groundwater aspect of this for a long time. The initial goal there was to protect the South Street wells, to keep that groundwater chemical plume from migrating more or less to the south and the west. Its natural flow tends to be to the south and the east, where it crosses the town of Union Line and then into the Susquehanna River. But the groundwater remediation program, begun in 1981, has actually taken a couple of nibbles out of the western edge and the southern edge to keep those wells safe. Here's Bill Wirtz.
Conservation in Albany, and I've been the technical advisor on this project. I actually got involved with EPA headquarters folks a couple of years ago on developing some of the initial vapor guidance that was put out, and have continued to work with those folks on vapor issues. Okay. You can just go to the next slide then. So this is the New York State DEC, and you can go to the next slide if you want. Really, there are three major issues that we see, both in terms of technical issues and also regulatory issues. Those have to do, number one, with the presence of volatile organic compounds in the groundwater. And Wayne and Mitch, I think, have done a very good job of describing what the status of the project was regarding the volatile organic compounds in the groundwater. The other had to do with the compounds migrating from the groundwater into the buildings, and then an issue that we actually didn't envision as being a significant issue when we started this project, but it's clear that it has become one, is the issue of site classification. Groundwater issues, where are we, where are we going? Basically, when the groundwater project, when the groundwater remedial project first started in the late 70s, early 80s, the intent of that project was to stop the contamination, the groundwater contamination, from getting to the village well field. At that point in time, people really didn't worry very much about vapors coming off of groundwater plumes, and in fact, you know, there was some rudimentary understanding of how vapor migration might take place, but typically, and specifically at this site, everybody who was working on the project felt that the groundwater contamination was too deep, and the levels of contamination that were flowing in buildings in the village, beneath buildings in the village, were relatively low, and nobody anticipated that there would be a groundwater to vapor and then vapor to building issue. And it's really only been in the past few years that the issue has matured to the point where we've actually started to go back to sites like this one, which we thought we had under full control, and have been revisiting. So, let me just catch myself here for a second. So one of the things that we've done now with the groundwater piece of the puzzle is we've gone back to IBM, and the documents are in the repository here in the library in the village. You can see the work plans that have been approved. But the goal of those work plans in terms of the groundwater plume, number one, is to try to address the source area. That's the area of greatest contamination that's on the former IBM factory property. There's still a fair bit of contamination there in the groundwater, and we've charged them with going back to see if there's anything that can be done to remove more of that contamination more quickly, and failing that, to at least make sure that it's being contained as fully as possible at the plant site itself, so that as time goes on, it won't be migrating beneath the buildings in the village. The other thing that we've done, and again, initially the concept was to protect the wells, and so to protect the drinking wells. And so the remedial system that went in was designed basically to keep the plume from growing, to keep it from migrating down to where the drinking water supply is. And that, I think, has been quite effective. But what's resulted is there's still a plume of contamination beneath buildings. When that remedial system was designed and approved, people were already on public water supplies, so there was no concern about somebody drilling a well in their yard and intercepting that contaminated groundwater. So the idea was that we would just let it sit, we would pump it, and eventually the plume would dissipate and shrink through time. What we've charged IBM with, because we now know that the plume represents a source of vapor into buildings, or a potential source in some places, a real source in others, we've charged them with seeing what they can do to actually shrink the size of that plume, so that over time, over the next 5 or 10 years, instead of seeing, I don't know if you can, yeah. I guess I don't have it, I'm sorry. Instead of seeing the geometry of the plume as we see it today, it will shrink to be smaller and smaller. And so ultimately the need for these vapor systems that IBM is now working diligently to provide will no longer be necessary. So that's the groundwater piece, and the recommendations of how they're going to try to accomplish those things are due by the end of this year. And you know, those of you who live in the village, I'm sure at this point you've seen trucks out there in many places. Additional wells are being installed to just get a better characterization of how we might go about shrinking that plume and addressing the source area. So that's the groundwater piece. In terms of the vapor issues, well, I've already kind of talked about where we stand really in terms of the development of the science. If you go to the next slide, I concur with IBM's position that 85 to 95% of the buildings that require ventilation systems, mitigation systems, have been identified. And what we set out to do in the fall when we put this
The new news we're hearing from Bill Wirtz of the DEC tonight is that there will indeed be an effort made to address the pollution at its source, that being the IBM campus itself, ground zero, if you will, near where that 1979 leak of 4,100 gallons of 1,1,1-trichloroethane occurred, underground, and subsequently there were discoveries made of other chemicals beneath the ground as well. Now, Bill Wirtz says that IBM has until the end of the year to change the strategy, essentially, from what it was in 1981, which was to protect the South Street wells, which Bill Wirtz says has been accomplished, that it has worked well to pump out thousands upon thousands of gallons of groundwater every day, run the water through carbon filters, and then dump the filtered water back into the storm sewers. He says that has worked to protect the wells. It isn't doing enough to shrink this groundwater plume, now that we know that the groundwater plume represents at least a potential source of vapors, solvent vapors, VOCs, into people's homes and businesses. So the strategy is going to change, according to the DEC. This is something new.
We've identified, you know, the vast majority of homes that are going to need to be ventilated, and now what we're trying to do with this next heating season is to go along those margins where the level of contamination that will be found in the homes is almost certain to be quite small, right at the kind of our ability to detect and determine that it's truly present from our ability to, well, just to detect that it's truly present. And if you go to the next slide, again, this is the same slide that IBM put up. That's the limits of ventilation as currently defined. And really, from my perspective, I think what we're going to be doing is primarily just sampling along these fringe areas. And although we may be sampling quite a few structures, again, my sense is that we'll find a very small percentage of those structures that will end up needing any kind of mitigation. And you can just scroll through that. Okay, the final issue is site classification. And in the DEC, we have, as the federal EPA actually does too, two different programs that work on hazardous waste sites. One of the programs that most people are familiar with is the Superfund program. And that's a program that's designed to work at inactive hazardous waste sites. Typically, they're sites where they've been abandoned or where there are a number of responsible parties that could be responsible for the contamination. And that's the site program, that's the program that uses a site classification system as a way of prioritizing work that needs to be done on sites and identifying pretty much where the site fits into that prioritization process. I happen to work in the RECRA program, which deals more or less in a parallel fashion with hazardous waste sites, but we deal with sites that there's an active industrial presence. Sites like IBM or other GE sites, any number of sites, large and small, where there's still an active party present at that facility, and they take the responsibility, full responsibility, for doing any necessary investigation and remediation. And that's the process that we've been working under on both the groundwater remediation program and the vapor migration program here in the village of Endicott. And in essence, there's a permit that requires IBM to undertake the necessary remedial activities, and a process by which they submit work plans, and they go through a review process by the DEC and by State Health Department and Broome County Health Department, and then ultimately those documents are approved and they become incorporated by reference into the permit so that it legally binds IBM to do the work that we've approved. And the issue with the site classification process really is one in which, under the Superfund program, if you're going to do work, it's important to have the site classified properly, because that's what allows the state or federal governments to spend money to work on the project. In the case of the RECRA program, the site classification, whether it's a 2 or a 4, has absolutely no bearing on the activities that we perform. And I can assure you that we have moved as quickly as we could possibly move on this project, and we would have moved no more quickly had this project been managed as a Class 2 site under the State Superfund program. It just would not have accelerated the rate of progress. So where we stand.
Here's a little background on what Bill Wirtz is talking about right now. Class 4 means that the situation is pretty much a closed hazardous waste site requiring continued maintenance. Class 2 would mean an acknowledgement, legally speaking, that there is some threat to the environment and some threat to health, represented by the site. Now, the site we're talking about here is the area over this groundwater plume of chemicals. A lot of people in the village, and most visibly, someone not in the village, Congressman Maurice Hinchey, has petitioned the DEC not once but twice to try to get the urgency of this classification upgraded to reflect the perception in the village that, yes, indeed, this does represent a threat to the environment, if not an immediate threat to human health. The DEC has been kind of stubborn about that, saying that what you just heard Bill Wirtz say wouldn't have made a difference. Maybe under Superfund, yes, but this is a RCRA site. Resource Conservation and Recovery Act is the legislation that governs how this is being handled, and Bill Wirtz says that it wouldn't have made a difference. Whether it was more urgent on paper or not, they wouldn't have done anything different on the ground, or in this case, under the ground.
In the process of evaluating those, then the site or new sites could be reclassified. We've heard loud and clear from folks in the village that they felt reclassification was an important issue, and I think all I can say at this point is we are still considering whether we should do that or not. And then just contact information. We'll be available tomorrow from 2 till 8. We'll be here as long as we can. I'll stay awake as long as I can. And there are a number of folks. This represents our contact list. You're free to call any of those folks, both state and county folks, to answer any questions that you don't get answered tonight. And please come and visit us tomorrow, and we'll do our best to answer your questions then. Thank you.
All right, that was Bill Wirtz of the state DEC, receiving a round of applause in the Union Endicott High School Auditorium. This is News Channel 34 continuing live star coverage of the meeting between the Endicott Village Board, representatives from IBM, representatives from state regulatory agencies talking about the underground chemicals that has recently been found to shed vapors into people's homes and businesses. The next speaker is Dan Garrity from the State Department of Health, talking about the issue that is probably forefront in everyone's minds, and that is, do these low levels exposed over a long period of time constitute a real health threat? Dan Garrity.
I'll keep my remarks brief so that we can move on to answering your questions. My department's role in investigations of this type is to work with the New York State DEC as a lead agency to identify and remediate potential or actual human exposures to toxic compounds. We also evaluate the likelihood of health effects in the affected communities. When it became apparent in the late fall of 2002 that the potential existed for soil vapors to migrate into some buildings in Endicott, our goal became the rapid identification of the nature and extent of the soil vapor impacts and the prompt installation of the systems to mitigate the affected structures. Like you, we were fairly surprised at the number of buildings and homes impacted, but we have found from our analysis of the sampling data collected to date that the levels of soil vapors detected in indoor air are lower than the levels known to cause health effects in people and animals. Trichloroethylene, or TC, has been the primary contaminant of concern during this investigation. 140 micrograms per cubic meter was the highest level of TC measured in indoor air to date. This concentration is about 300 times lower than levels known to cause effects on the central nervous system in humans. The average concentration of TC measured in indoor air of all the buildings sampled to date is almost 20 times lower than that 140 microgram per cubic meter detection. Nevertheless, because we knew the people of Endicott would not want any levels of chemicals migrating into the buildings, we recommended, and IBM agreed, that subslab mitigation systems should be offered wherever indoor air quality was or could be affected by soil vapors from the IBM plume. This recommendation was not based primarily on specific health concerns, but on the principle that when possible, practical measures should be taken to reduce or eliminate exposures to harmful chemicals. The other role of my department since the beginning of this investigation has been to work with your community so we can better understand your concerns and hopefully help you understand the significance of our findings. To this end, we have spoke and met with federal, state, and local officials, educators, church leaders, bankers, realtors, community groups, and the news media. But more importantly, many hundreds of concerned parents and residents of Endicott. Now that the majority of the sampling phase of the investigation has been completed, the focus of our efforts will turn from the collection and analysis of data to working more closely with your community and to designing a health study to address the concerns that you have expressed to us. In closing, I'd like to mention that for a short time in the early 90s, I was a resident of Endicott. I went to college and worked in Broome County for almost 10 years. The last 3 of those years, I worked for Mr. Denz at the Broome County Health Department. I still have many friends and family living, working, and raising families in the study area. I'd like to think that I have some understanding of your community and your concerns, and I promise that the New York State Department of Health will do everything we can to help you through this difficult time. Thank you.
Dan Garrity of the New York State Department of Health, probably not telling people what they want to hear, and they want to hear, you know, is this stuff going to hurt me, or is this stuff something not to really be that worried about? Next on the agenda, as we have it here, is Mario Nerci. Goes by Mike. Answers the phone. Mike Nerci. He's an environmental engineer, formerly with the DEC.
I'm Tom
Well, I guess we're getting somebody else. Mike Nerty's going to have to wait. This is somebody else from the State Health Department. Tom Johnson, I believe he said his name was.
A little bit of what Dan said, but I wanted to give you some information on trichloroethene, which is the major contaminant of concern here, tell you about the kinds of health effects it causes, and then explain how they relate to the levels that have been found in the buildings in the area. Trichloroethene is a volatile organic chemical. It's a liquid at room temperature. It evaporates fairly easily into air. And it's primarily used as a solvent for degreasing metal machinery parts. Health effects, what kind of health effects does it cause? It's primarily causes effects on the central nervous system type effects. Excuse me? Oh, I'm sorry. It causes health effects on the central nervous system. These kinds of health effects occur at very high levels of exposure. We see these types of effects in people who work with the chemical on a day-in, day-out basis and are exposed to fairly high levels compared to what you and I would probably get in a typical everyday situation. It's also, those types of effects are also seen in accidental poisonings when people actually get exposed to the chemical at high levels for short periods of time. Other types of health effects, I know there's some concern about cancer. There's an elevated risk for cancer, a small increased risk for people who work with the chemical on a day-in, day-out basis in occupational settings, and also for people who are exposed to the chemical as well as other chemicals in contaminated drinking water. Now, the studies of those types of increased risks are limited in the sense that the exposure information is poor, and the people were also exposed to other chemicals in addition to trichloroethene. So we can't conclude from those studies that trichloroethene causes cancer in human beings. However, we can conclude that there may be an increased risk for cancer for people who are exposed to trichloroethene on a long-term basis, chronic basis. We also know that in laboratory animals, animals that are exposed to high levels of the chemical for their lifetimes get cancer. We also know that the chemical causes effects on the liver, kidney, and nervous system, and on their ability to bear healthy offspring. Now, what does all this mean with respect to the kinds of air levels that have been found in the buildings near the facility? The exposure levels that cause most of those health effects that I talked about are very high. The central nervous system is the most sensitive to trichloroethene. The lowest, what we call effect level, the lowest air concentrations in which we know central nervous system effects are seen is about 40,000 micrograms per cubic meter. It takes a lot of the chemical to cause those types of health effects. And you compare that with the levels that we found in the buildings near the facility. The highest level we found was 140 micrograms per cubic meter, and the average level that we found was around 10 micrograms per cubic meter. So you compare 40,000 micrograms per cubic meter, which is the level that we know causes health effects for central nervous system toxicity. Compare that 40,000 with 140, which is about 300 times lower. We compare that also to 10 micrograms per cubic meter, which is the average level. That's about 4,000 times lower. So the levels that have been found in the buildings near the facility are relatively low compared to the levels that cause adverse health effects in human beings. And that's why we've been saying we don't think that people are really going to get sick at being exposed to these levels. We don't think there's an imminent health hazard. However, because of the information that we have from the animal studies and the information that we have of people who are occupationally exposed or exposed to the chemical in drinking water, we want to avoid long-term exposure to the chemical because it may be associated with an increased risk for cancer. And that's why we're saying, long-term exposure should be mitigated to the greatest extent practical. That's why we supported putting in the ventilation systems on the homes. And at this point, I'll have Carolina Shabsis talk to you about the health study.
Hello, my my name is Carolina Shapsis. I'm an epidemiologist with the New York State Department of Health, and I'd just like to summarize for you some aspects of our health study proposal for the community. Approximately 4,000 copies of this was sent out to the community during last week, and so if you don't have the documentation or didn't receive it, please see me. I have additional copies, or you can see me tomorrow at the availability session from 2 to 8 p.m. You can go to the next slide, please. New York State has gathered health concerns from Endicott residents for the past 6 months, especially at 2 of the previous availability sessions that we've held, but also from telephone calls and speaking with other residents. Cancer, especially childhood cancer, has been a particular concern that we've heard of in the community. And we would like to receive your input on our proposal. There are additional opportunities to still share your concerns with us. We're going to determine the study area boundaries and the time frame in consultation with the community and with the environmental data we've collected to date. We're available, as I said before, from 2 to 8 p.m. tomorrow to talk about specific health concerns that you or your family may have. Additionally, we're going to have environmental and health concern sheets that you can fill out and report to us in that manner if you're more comfortable that way. Next slide, please. Our health study proposal consists of using existing health records to geographically study birth outcomes, including birth certificate data and data from our congenital malformations registry and all cancer diagnoses from our cancer registry. I think it's really important to note that these data are quite good, and I'll go into that a little bit later. After scientific review of our TCE literature and the community concerns that we've heard from you to date, we think that this is a good initial proposal to the community. As far as birth outcomes, we're interested in birth weight, weight accounting for gestational age, male-female ratios, and possible birth defects or congenital malformations. As far as cancer, we'll analyze all cancer outcomes, and we'll also include childhood cancers and adult cancers separated out so you can see the differences between the two. What will this study do? Well, our goal here is to answer the following question. We want to know if these health conditions are unusually elevated in the study area. If we find unusual elevations of disease, we'll determine appropriate follow-up steps, which could include interviews or questionnaire studies, taking individual medical histories, and evaluating possibly environmental or biological sampling depending on the situation. Thank you. Every study inherently has some strengths and limitations, and would like to discuss these with you tonight. We'll also be available, as I said before, tomorrow to speak with you further about some of the pluses and minuses of doing a study like this and what a study like this can tell us. As I said previously, there's high quality data available at the state presently where we can evaluate some of these conditions. Our cancer registry, birth certificate data, and our congenital malformations registry get their data mandatorily reported by different agencies in the state. So this is data we collect by law. So we have a very good data set to work with. This is statewide data, so we're able to compare rates that we may find here with rates across upstate New York. And this is a proposal for a first step in evaluating the health status of the community. We can take additional steps as is necessary once we see the results of this, or depending on your community concerns. Next, please. As I said, every study has its limitations as well as its strengths. I think it's important to point out with a study of this type, geographic mobility is sometimes an issue. We're going to evaluate, with our cancer registry, residents at the time of cancer diagnosis. This is going to be less of an issue for birth outcome data because most people, well, less people move right after birth when they identify some of these birth outcomes. But cancers develop usually later in life, so there is some difficulty in noting some of these cancers associated with an address. We also won't be able to link health outcomes with specific causes from a study like this, but it will tell us if these health conditions are unusually elevated. And we can address my second point up there, health outcomes and specific causes in a follow-up study if we find an elevation. Additionally, to protect confidentiality of the health data, we can identify small numbers to the community. That means, very simply, that if there are less than 6 cases of a specific condition identified, we can't give you the exact number of cases that that represents. And that's what we do to try to protect individual characteristics that may be released by narrowing down of such small numbers. Final slide, please. Finally, I'd just like to encourage you to give me a call or talk with me tomorrow if you need any further information about our plan or proposal. Would like a lot of input from you about what's important to you for us to study, and if this doesn't cover your concerns. Please feel free to give me a call or drop me an email. Thank you.
That was Carolina Shopsis, an
thank-
epidemiologist with the State Department of Health, describing the health study that has begun in Endicott, more to collect information from the people of Endicott than to disperse it to them. Obviously, the question they have is the stuff that is getting into my home in small amounts and may have been doing so for many, many years, causing any health problems to members of my family? Some people have a gut instinct that yes, it has. And they would like to have that confirmed or denied one way or the other. And what they're hearing from Carolina Shopsis is they're probably not going to get any definitive answers, even after the study is done. Mayor Colella is going through the agenda for the remainder of the evening, and up next, questions from members of the Endicott Village Board, some of which may have come from News Channel 34 viewers via our website. We turned those over to the mayor last week.
If you're going to ask a question to any of the participants this evening.
The first question or comment that I have is, I've spoken with several people in the village on all of these, and they asked me to bring this up tonight. I want to commend you that you are planning on testing the high school, but there are also concerns for, and you may not be able to address this tonight, but at least think about the Boys and Girls Club, the library, and the Seton campus, which are probably all closer to the plume than the UE High School, but there are large concentrations of people in these areas, and I've been asked to ask you if you would consider testing them. Also, as a member of the Board of Trustees, I would like to suggest that you could maybe set up an on-site office for people to call and make appointments. I know you have a 1-888 number, but people do express difficulty in reaching someone and getting results from that. So perhaps you could set up an on-site office where people could call, make an appointment, and you know, even if it's only 2 days a week for the rest of the year, at least they would be able to come in and talk to you about their concerns. Third, I would like to know if we can talk about trying to implement a 5 to 10 year plan. I keep hearing that it's going to take longer than that. I don't know. I don't know if anyone has a magic crystal ball for that, but if we can at least try and make it a 5 to 10 year plan. I know this has been going on since 1979. And it seems like a long time to people, and maybe we could at least come up with a plan to try and shorten this process. And that's all the questions or comments I have for now.
Are there any other board members who'd like to ask any questions?
Yes. If people have opted not to have their home ventilated at this time, if they are in the plume area, will they be allowed at a later time to have that completed?
All right, I guess IBM
Yes. That question is for IBM.
You can use your microphone.
Mr. Myers? Also, are you going to answer that, or? No?
All right, the question was, if you opted not to have your home evaluated or ventilated, can you at a later date?
If you're in the plume area.
I don't think this mic is working right. It is. This one is. Okay, thank you. And Mr. Mayor, we will take answers to the questions in whatever way you deem most effective for yourself, the trustees, and the audience at large. I'll start with the most recent questions first, but I promise to immediately thereafter answer the three questions that you asked. I think your question was, if someone chose not to have their home sampled now, who is within the project area, and if they subsequently decide that they would like to have it sampled, will we consider doing that? Ventilated. Okay, the question was ventilated or sampled? Okay, ventilated. We are offering ventilation at all of the properties which are eligible under the project criteria based on either sampling or based on what the data show us what needs to be sampled. So we will ventilate every property that is eligible for the system. It's somewhat of a hypothetical, but we would need to look at the specific case. I do believe that we have already identified 85 to 95% of the places that need ventilation. But if a place came to our attention that we missed that is qualified for ventilation under the criteria, we would absolutely do that.
Thank you.
Can I answer that for just a second? I think Wayne may not have understood the question in the same way I did. If I'm correct, you were asking if somebody kind of passed on the ventilation right now, could they come back and ask to be ventilated again?
That's correct.
And from the state's perspective, the answer to that is absolutely yes. In fact, what we've said to IBM is within that limits of ventilation area, all homes or all buildings that have not been ventilated, who chose not to, at least once a year, they're going to be sending letters to all of those properties indicating that there was an offer of ventilation made to that property, and once again reiterating that that offer is still outstanding, so that at any time, on an annual basis, they'll get a letter, and at any time in between then, if somebody changes their mind and decides they want ventilation, that will be available. IBM will do that. Part of our issue was, somebody may choose not to be ventilated and then sell their house. The new person coming in, we wanted to make sure that, at least within that one-year time period, that they would have the same opportunities that everybody else did. So if you pass now for whatever reason, you can always come back.
Thank you. A question that someone called me on, and they said if 4,000 gallons originally had leaked in 1979, why has IBM taken out approximately 66,000 gallons?
Does this work? Yes, it is. The question was, if 4,000 gallons leaked in 1979, why has IBM taken out, you mentioned 66,000 gallons since then? So let us first all have the same understanding about what happened in 1979 and the chemical we're dealing with and what has been taken out of the groundwater. In 1979, there was a release at IBM of about 4,100 gallons of a chemical called TCA. And as that release occurred and was reported, the team of IBM people in place at that time did their best to respond to it and pull as much out as they could. As we mentioned, it was around that same time that IBM had begun to unilaterally remediate contaminated groundwater in the village of Endicott. In the subsequent 8 years, the first 8 years after this remediation began, it is absolutely true that our pumping and extraction system pulled out 10 times that amount of that chemical, TCA, from the groundwater in Endicott. So what does that tell us? That tells all of us that there had been in the groundwater in Endicott a lot more TCA than had been associated with the release of the 4,100 gallons from the incident in 1979. It's exactly what that tells us. There had been more of that chemical in the groundwater than had been associated with that release.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just have one more comment that I would like to make, and that is that I did receive in the mail this flyer from IBM telling about the project update of the Endicott Groundwater Vapor Project. It's a 10-page report, and I would suggest that, or 9 pages, excuse me, I would suggest that everyone avail themselves of this report. It answers a lot of questions. And the numbers are on the back with IBM that you can get this report. Thank you for answering my question.
Are there any other questions from the board before we get on to our representatives?
Maybe they can answer my questions now.
What was that, Bernie? About the schools?
Well, the first one was about the schools.
Sure, I did write down your 3 questions. They were, would IBM consider testing other nearby places, and you gave some specific examples. Second question was, would we consider setting up an on-site office that might make it easier for you to make appointments and the like? And third question was, might it be possible for there to be a quote-unquote 5 to 10-year plan for groundwater, presumably? So with those being the 3 questions, first off, will we consider testing other nearby places like the specific ones that you mentioned? While I don't personally know the merits of each of those cases and places, we will look at each of them, and we will first suggest that the people who operate those places speak with the New York State Department of Health. I think it would be appropriate for them to get some advice from the health department about what sampling encompasses and offer some advice about whether it's appropriate there. If following that there's a desire, we at IBM will consider them on a case-by-case basis. That doesn't answer it directly, but I will tell you that we'll make a decision very quickly, as I think we did in the case of this high school. Second question on an office for setting up appointments. One of our objectives, as I mentioned, is to communicate with you more effectively. We will consider that if indeed it turns out that that can be an effective thing for many of you. We're opening to trying new things. And then lastly, can there be a 5 to 10-year plan? I sure don't know. The reality of groundwater remediation is that it is a very long-term process. And what's occurred and is occurring here in Endicott is not very much different from many places across the United States and around the world where the remediation of contaminated groundwater is taking place. We did say, and I think Bill Wirtz referenced, that IBM is undertaking a supplemental groundwater investigation as part of our work. And that effort, which will be led by Craig Robertson and his firm, will give us additional information about what may be possible given the exact circumstances here in Endicott.
Thank you.
I can add to that just briefly. Is this on? One of the things that we did charge IBM with actually when we approved their groundwater, the plume piece of the assessment was to come up with an estimate of how much change we should expect to see in the plume after this new system is installed. And there'll be some kind of a prediction, if you want to look at it that way, that'll be out on the table for everybody to see and understand. And it will be something akin to, you know, a certain percentage of reduction over some kind of a time frame. It won't be something that necessarily, you know, if it's off by 5% or 10%, you know, we're going to say, gee, that's terrible. But it's going to be kind of a pathway that we would expect if we understand the system's behavior adequately, and we'll be tracking that through time to make sure that we stay on target.
Thank you. The village representatives are Mike Nerchi, who formerly worked for the DEC. His retired from that position, has been employed now by the Village of Endicott as our environmental engineer. Patrick Dorner, who is chairman of the Mayor's Advisory Committee on Village Contamination. His committee consists of Mr. Becker, to my left, Mari Nerchi, and Dr. Dennis Kovalik. These two individuals will be available at the Village, or numbers will be provided where they may answer questions also. Also representing the Village this evening is Dean S. Sommer, S-O-M-M-E-R. He is with Young Sommer LLC, which is a law firm out of Albany. He would like to make a few comments this time. Mr. Sommer, could you use the microphone? Yes.
I had a question, and I think Matt wanted to make a statement.
Could you wait till Mr. Sommer makes his presentation, and we'll go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Let me first start off by saying, Wayne, I think the village shares your goal of trying to keep the lawyers out of this, so I'll try to keep this short, and I have some suggestions and requests on behalf of the village, and forgive my voice, I have a cold. Generally, in cases such as this, you can really break down the concerns of the community into two principal areas, health and home. And the situation where you have an involuntary long-term chronic exposure to hazardous substances in one's homes is extraordinarily disruptive. And I know that when I was in the government, the friends of mine in the health department used to tell me that the stress associated with the unknown could create, have as great impacts as the substances themselves. So the village basically is looking to IBM to go to, if need be, extraordinary lengths to solve this problem, and to do so in a timely manner. It's been a very long time for everyone to come out tonight over a 2-decade-old problem. But what the village expects at this point is to be part of the abatement process and the discussions with regard to abating the public nuisance that exists, just as the DEC has responsibilities with regard to the abatement of a public nuisance, as well as the Attorney General's office. Municipal governments have that same responsibility, and here the village has decided that it's time to become sufficiently involved that they want to be at the table in the discussions on the abatement measures. The village also would like IBM to provide all the reports that are submitted to DEC and DOH directly to the village, to Mike Nerchi, so that our technical consultant has copies and can be reviewing them at a concurrent time with the health department and the DEC. So we would ask for copies in addition to those that are sent to the repository. The village then would intend to participate in meetings at which remedial action discussions will take place, and we ask tonight the representatives from DOH and DEC to advise their division directors that the village expects to be at the table on remedial action discussions. And Wayne, we ask that you please advise those agencies that you would support the village's involvement at those meetings. Now, with regard to health and home, there is, although I think that this situation is not all that common, there is an incident in Rochester that you probably know about at Kodak Park many years ago in the Rand Street and the Chota neighborhood. And in order to address the home prong, Eastman Kodak developed a value protection plan. And your staff may have already told you about this value protection plan, but the village would at least ask you to consider obtaining copies of what Eastman Kodak did and consider implementing that plan in town. That would stabilize property values and at least would relieve the anxiety that homeowners might have with regard to the impact of the contamination on their what's likely to be the largest investment they've ever made. In terms of the venting systems, we'll leave this to DEC, but we assume that there's going to be post-installation sampling in order to confirm that the systems are effective. Related to that, the health department or it may have been DEC, mentioned that notices of the offers of ventilation were going out to homeowners, and we would just ask you to be careful with regard to whether tenants are being advised of their rights, whether letters are going to homeowners, and you should make certain that the people actually living in the homes are aware of the situation. I have a few quick questions. One of which, and I may just be misunderstanding it, vadose zone contamination, in other words, contamination in the soil above the groundwater and the surface, has been known for many years, and soil gas sampling has been standard. And at some point I would like to understand why or whether any soil gas sampling had ever been conducted in the community. And then related to that, with regard to your criteria in the homes, is that a criteria that the health department now has approved of, and was that based on your sampling capability, or was it based on some percentage of a detection level that the health department feels comfortable with? Finally, just a short question. You talked about these different incidents of the spill. I have a question with regard to whether there's a soil source on that site. There's been a lot of discussion about groundwater, but there's a source that's getting into the groundwater, unless you're saying the source has been removed. And the village would like to make certain that you go back and evaluate whether you've done a source track down. To the DEC, the village requests that the program be shifted from the RCRA program to the Superfund program, and that the company be placed under an order on consent to do the work. We think after 20-some-odd years, the RCRA program, it may be time to shift it into Superfund. And then the final comment goes to what I regard as, I think you've done a good job in evaluating the extent of this plume, and you're talking about the border areas. But the problem with waiting until the winter is you're really shifting the burden onto the homeowner. Once winter gets here, homes act as chimneys. So what you're really doing is you're waiting until the vapor is in the home. And I would ask you to consider, and I'd ask the health department to consider, whether or not it's better to shift the risk back onto the company. Go to the border areas, install systems, and then when winter comes, go and sample. And if you have hits, then you turn on the systems. But there's really no reason to I think, shift the burden onto the homeowner to wait for your sampling at that time. Other than that, thank you, and the village looks forward to working cooperatively with IBM in terms of abating these conditions.
Thank you. Two other trustees had questions. Valerie Gobo, you had a question?
Yeah, that was Dean Summers. He's the lawyer who was recently hired by the village to be the sharp end of the spear here in advocating for the village's desire to be part of this. Mike Nerchi has complained all along that it's been left out of the loop, that IBM has dealt with the regulatory agencies and the homeowners as individuals, but hasn't really said anything to the village.
I just don't quite understand how you come up with that number. If you could elaborate on that.
Would you like to handle that?
Sure. Take them. We'll take them all now in order, starting with Valerie's question. The question again, I think, was how do we know how much spilled in 1979? Right?
Right.
Mitch, I'm going to ask you to take that. I think.
I guess the best answer that I have for that is that was an estimate that was prepared by the people that, excuse me, that responded to and conducted, the response to the spill, and as well as the ensuing investigation. At this point, we've reviewed, the available records, and those are the amounts that they calculated at that time. And I have no ability to add to that at this point.
That question, how much was really spilled versus how much has been extracted since then, came up at the meeting with the lawyers a couple of weeks ago. In fact, that was the lawyers' question number one. If 4,100 gallons of TCA spilled, how come they've recovered 72,000 gallons so far? So that's kind of the genesis of that big question.
The village would like a seat at the table for project meetings. I'm not, we'll have to talk in further detail about what seat at the table means. Let me just say that on a project like this, there are routine day-to-day conversations and discussions between IBM as the regulated entity and the Department of Environmental Conservation as the regulator. They occur regularly, daily, telephone, sometimes there are meetings and the like. And that is a very normal process that occurs in almost all circumstances like this around the country. We expect that those routine meetings, discussions, deliberations will absolutely continue. When there are times at which there are formal meetings at which the village needs to be informed, we'll certainly be happy to speak with your assigned representative about that. So that's in essence a way of saying I'm not sure what seat at the table encompasses in its entirety, but at the same time saying that we have every intention of keeping you informed of the decisions, the facts, the deliberations, etc. You mentioned the village would like concurrent copies of what goes to the repository. We can certainly do that. You mentioned something about Rochester, New York, and Kodak. I am not at all familiar with what you've mentioned. You guessed that I am, but I'll tell you that I'm not. I have no idea whether or not the circumstances that Kodak encountered in Rochester, New York are similar or analogous to the circumstances here, but I will certainly learn about it. Post-installation sampling, it's important for you to understand how it is known if these systems are working. The best person to explain this one is going to be Paul Sanborn, so let me ask Paul to talk about how it is known whether the systems are working.
Thanks, Wayne. With respect to the design and installation of the ventilation systems that we're putting into buildings and homes within the ventilation area, these systems are being engineered in a very quantitative way. Through multiple visits to homeowners and work done in assessing conditions within the homes, we determined from an engineering perspective what the pathways, the potential pathways for groundwater vapors to enter the lowest habitable portion of your house, typically your basement. For example, if there are cracks in the floor or holes in the floor, or if there's an expansion joint between a floor slab and a foundation wall, these are areas where typically vapors could enter the house. So, frankly, before we do any work to design a system, we often find ourselves doing work to repair those rather obvious penetrations just to eliminate those pathways and tighten up the house, so to speak. And in some instances, we've taken what may be considered an unusual measure of pouring a slab, basically to create a boundary between the bottom of the house and the ground. Once we have what we think is a relatively tight structure to work with, during the design visits, we do some engineering tests where we make a penetration through the floor and extract by means of a shop vacuum and basically apply a pressure to a hole, a penetration through the floor to suck air out from beneath the house. And we have test holes, typically around the perimeter of the foundation, where we can measure either with a vacuum gauge or visually using a smoke stick to see whether smoke is coming into a house or whether it's going down the hole out of the house, to test to assure that we can establish a negative pressure underneath the building. The reason that groundwater vapors get into a house is because most buildings have a slight negative pressure inside relative to outside. There's a tendency for air to move in rather than out. And as others have alluded to earlier, this situation is accentuated in the wintertime when your furnaces are running because they need makeup air to burn the fuel. And that tends to accentuate that negative pressure, so that tends to draw more air in from the subsurface. And that's why we've done the testing during the heating season in your basements, because that's the location and the time of year when we're most likely to encounter groundwater vapors. If there is vapor intrusion, we're best able to assess for its presence then. During the design visit, we will determine through this testing just how many extraction points we think we need to effectively create that negative pressure beneath the building. And the goal of these systems is very simple. We want to make the flow of air go the other way. By sucking air out from beneath the building, you create, in a relative sense, a vacuum beneath the building, so air inside has a tendency to move out rather than in. So that if there are vapors beneath the building emanating from groundwater, and you've established this negative pressure beneath the building, they can't physically get into the building. Once the systems are installed, we go back and do additional testing, again with the same type of equipment and the same approach, to assure that these systems have in fact performed as they were designed, and that we have been able to create this reverse pressure gradient, this negative pressure beneath the entire building. Once that condition is established, then the pathway for vapors to enter the home is cut off. They can't get in. And that physical testing is done at every house, and it's a diagnostic indicator. If you can demonstrate that you've established that negative pressure beneath the entire slab, then vapors cannot get into the homes. In some instances, we've gone back and will continue to go back to do some additional quality assurance checks to make sure that we've got these systems performing as efficiently as we can. And further, there will be a program of post-ventilation indoor air sampling that will be done during the next heating season. And we expect to do that in about 10% of the locations where we have ventilation systems. And we will do this in those locations typically where the designs have been the most technically complex. There are some structures that are pretty large, not typically a small home, but a multiple foundation building where
That's Paul Sanborn talking. He's the head of the company that's designing the groundwater vapor remediation systems, the vent systems in the homes. And in case you forgot the question, it was a question posed by the village's attorney to the effect that after these home-by-home systems are installed, won't you, IBM, or your subcontractors go back and retest the quality of the indoor air? Remember, they test for 11 different volatile organic compounds that are known to be constituents of this underground groundwater plume. The answer, to give you the short answer, the answer is no. The tests will be done on about 10% of the properties where the engineering challenges were the greatest. The only other tests that will be done to see if these systems are working will be strictly mechanical tests to see if the fans installed do indeed create a negative pressure area beneath the slab of the house, beneath the basement, so that vapors in the house would have a tendency to be sucked out rather than intrude into the living space. So there won't be tests in everybody's house to see if those chemical contaminants that were identified in the first place are in fact no longer there.
And if it's not, do you know where the discharge point for the groundwater is?
Sure. Craig Robertson?
Yeah. I guess if we could put that picture up on the screen, it'd probably be best. Okay, it's a little blurry, but do we have a pointer here?
I think that is, isn't it?
Thank you. I think this is the figure that you're talking about. That's one of the handouts that folks can pick up when they leave tonight. And just to orient you, see if this shows up. Here's the former IBM facility. This is North Street here and McKinley here, so that gets you oriented in the center of town. And the orange and yellow shaded area here is the larger of the plumes that IBM is remediating. This is a picture of the extent of TCE in groundwater in that plume. And I believe what the gentleman was referring to was these blue arrows here, which are groundwater flow direction arrows. And to make the answer short, and then I'll embellish, they do reflect the operation of groundwater extraction wells or cleanup wells that are operated by IBM here. This is hard here, essentially along a line across the plume, and also another well here, and then there's another well up here.
So where it just says in the graph, where it says groundwater flow direction, what that's supposed to be is groundwater flow direction with the pump when pumping wells
That's
are
correct.
in operation.
It's under current conditions, and the current conditions involve remediation pumping from the wells that I've shown here, and that is the groundwater flow direction that occurs as a result of that pumping. And this is, based on the current available data, the extent of the TCE plume, the larger TCE plume.
Prior to those wells, the groundwater flow direction would be towards the river, correct?
Yes. There weren't as many monitoring wells at that time prior to pumping. Pumping began in 1980, but they did show a general groundwater flow direction towards the river. While I have this up, I mean, I can show other facilities. This is the high school that we're in right now. The library is over here. Our Lady of Sorrows School is right here. And of course, the SNAP Junior High School is over here. There are other two
Yeah, it may be a little
small
difficult to follow some of what's going on here. It's hard to see the pointer there. But what they're talking about is the natural direction of the groundwater as it comes off the hillside north of the Susquehanna. And naturally speaking, it does, of course, flow downhill and into the river. And the point being made here is that those groundwater extraction pumps that are attached to huge charcoal filters are altering that somewhat, so that, as we said before, the initial goal was to keep the groundwater that is polluted from migrating down to the South Street well field, which is kind of south and a little bit to the west of the plume that you see there outlined in yellow, actually colored in yellow.
Old Village of Endicott dump. It's about a 35-acre area which borders the SNAP school and also the Endicott Plaza Shopping Center. So those facilities, the schools, the library, et cetera, and the location of the old dump and the location of the South Street well field have been placed on this map, along with the groundwater flow directions and the location of the IBM plume areas, to give you all some perspective on where the plume is with respect to those other facilities.
Cheryl, do you have a question?
You had touched briefly on the reclassification of a level 2. If you could just clarify my understanding for me. From what I understand is it's reclassified to a level 2. There is more money available from the state and the federal government, and couldn't we use this money to help speed up the process of the cleanup and also help with putting in do more testing and more ventilation systems? From my understanding, I believe IBM has a budget set aside for this type of spill. I don't know if that's capped, but wouldn't it be to the benefit to put this to a class 2, to get a hold of some of the federal and state money to help speed up with the ventilation systems in the cleanup?
This is Bill Wirtz. I'll try to answer that as best I can. Number one, to just give you some perspective on the rate at which we've progressed at this site versus other sites. And the closest site, I think, that we can use as an analogy is the Redfield site. And we've actually linked to that. There's a website that describes the activities that have taken place at the Redfield site, which is out near Denver, Colorado. If you look at some of the earlier DEC fact sheets, you'll find the link to that. It took them close to 3 years to do at that site what we've done in the last 7 months or so. So I think the rate of progress that we've made has really been about as good as you can do. As Wayne indicated, or somebody did, IBM has in the neighborhood of 100 people working full-time on this project. And that's a huge amount of resource that's being devoted to one project. In terms of the classification and providing more resources, IBM has done everything that we have asked them to do. The action plan that you can look at in the library, we basically told them we wanted them to put a mitigation system in any building where we could detect a discernible difference that we could associate with the contaminated groundwater, and they agreed to do that. And I've worked with a number of companies over the past 20+ years with the DEC, and there are many companies in the state of New York who would not have agreed to take that kind of a conservative approach. In terms of making more money available, I just don't think that the reclassification would in any way
Bill,
accelerate
the DEC, we're back to the topic of the classification of this site. The IBM campus, should it be a Class 4 or Class 2? Class 4 being closed but needing monitoring, Class 2 defined as posing some threat to the environment or health. And it also brings up the question asked by the village's lawyer, which was, why can't we get this out from under RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and have it become a Superfund site? The difference there being RCRA is widely viewed in the environmental community as being a much more polluter-friendly piece of legislation. Superfund is more aimed at getting things cleaned up. So that was a request from the village's lawyer, which I don't believe has been addressed so far.
Folks,
Well, the village asks you to ask your folks to have it managed by the Superfund branch. It's really not a question of which branch can handle it. It's a question that the village would prefer this being handled by the Superfund branch after these years, so that this is put under an order on consent.
Yeah, we have a permit.
That doesn't preclude an order on consent.
No, it doesn't. Well, I'll take that back to our management.
Yeah, IBM has a comment.
Just to offer an IBM perspective on your question, and I appreciate very much Bill's very candid answer to it. From our perspective, whether this is classified as a 2 or a 4 or any other classification is completely neutral to us. It will not make a difference in how much IBM spends or how quickly we spend it. We are doing all we can to address this under the exact criteria applied without regard to how it's classified. Our behavior will be identical no matter how someone chooses to classify it. You asked if we had a budget for this and if it's capped. We did not have a budget for this. And the reason we didn't have a budget for it is because we quite candidly, as I explained earlier, didn't realize that we'd be getting into it. But the IBM company, as it has done since 1979, is standing up unilaterally to address the problem. We have committed a substantial amount of resources in the past 4 to 6 months. We are not limited at that. We will apply the resources necessary to complete the project according to NISDEC's requirements.
Yeah, that's a little contrary to what we've been told by IBM in the past. We were given an actual figure that IBM, in the first meeting we had, that IBM had a certain amount of money set aside in millions of dollars. And I think Cheryl agrees with that.
Yes, that's what we were told before.
Let me comment on that. What I suspect you may have recalled about a figure of money set aside is the following. Under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which is RCRA, that's the acronym for it, there is a need for companies which have places like this around the country to demonstrate financial assurance to the government. And what that process is about is a company like ours demonstrates through accounting records certified by the independent auditor and signed by the chief financial officer that the company has monies set aside to handle these known problems. We at IBM for Endicott have indeed demonstrated this financial assurance, and in so doing, as we have done that yearly, we have said this is the amount of money we've set aside for Endicott. Now, as this groundwater vapor project comes to light, do we need to increase what we are setting aside? Yes, we do. We do that regularly and quarterly. But still, the important takeaway point is that there is not some limit at which IBM is going to say, oh, we've reached a limit, we can't do any more. That's what I'd like you to remember.
All right, I think it's probably time to allow the public to ask questions. Could Amy take the microphone back 3 or 4 seats, rows? Please identify yourself, give your name and address for the record. Keep your questions to 1 and within 2 minutes because we have so many people want to ask questions.
Are we on? Is it
Mr.
on?
Myers, excuse me a second. Mr. Myers, if you have your
I'm looking for the switch.
available,
Hello.
you might let us
Okay.
know.
My name is Skip Hausman. I'm a resident of Endicott, 600 Pinecrest Road. I'm also a retired IBM process engineer, and there's not too many of us left in the area that were there at the time. And I'm concerned that IBM has not talked about some of the other things that were done to prevent future spills, such as, at the time of the original spill, a containment was put around the place where the spill occurred, the fill area, where it would no longer be possible to spill it into the ground. They also dug up all the old underground tanks that used to be there, as did gas stations have to do this also, to assure that there were no leaks. All of the pipes that go from building to building are now in overhead double wall containers so that any leakage would fall out into the second thing and be detected immediately and repaired. The other thing that was done was that the vapors from exhaust fans, you know, to protect the workers, were collected on top of building 18. If you see all the the big boxes up there, these were carbon filters which picked up the vapors and recycled them. This material cost IBM money, and we didn't want to lose any into the atmosphere.
Can you get to your question, Skip, please?
My question is, why don't you tell people about all these things, including turning it to an aqueous process, water-based, which is treated over in the recycling building over on Clark Street? You know, why don't you put that into your information?
Well, you're absolutely right, Mr. Hausman, in what you report. Everything you said has occurred. IBM has, as the era of environmental consciousness came to fore throughout the 70s, the creation of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, different learning about protection. IBM invested substantial amounts of capital here in Endicott to do the exact kinds of things you described. Secondary containment, double wall tanks and pipes, above ground, inspectable, testable, auditable, all those things. We have not, as you correctly point out, identified all of those things to you. The reason why we haven't, maybe we're shortchanging ourselves or the understanding of this in some measure. We haven't done that probably out of the belief that many of you with the deepest concerns would first be interested in hearing from us about what's affecting you directly. But everything you report and you said is absolutely correct. and we'd be happy to provide that additional perspective if it's helpful to the community at large, and apparently at least to one it is, and we'll look into doing that. Thank you very much.
Be the next question. Hi, Wayne Richardson, 109 McKinley Avenue. I live in the lowest part as we head out of Endicott. I hear a lot of I don't knows, and we don't know. We don't know the health risks here. We don't know estimates on spills. My question is, though, if 4,100 gallons spilled in, you recovered 66,000 gallons of that chemical, is there somebody across the street from us who was dumping this stuff that we don't know about?
The truth is that there was a lot more TCA in the groundwater. IBM in 1979 began unilaterally, meaning only us, by ourselves, to perform contaminated groundwater supports that, because if we had wanted to cast blame, even all those years ago, we could have said, we'll do some of this, but not all of it, because you, and you had a part in it. We haven't done that, and the fact that we haven't means we don't want to cast blame. Now, are there other sources? We personally can't answer that.
Well, I mean,
there is a lot of material in the ground, and it came from somewhere.
Well, I looked at your plume just now that goes under my house. You're the only guy up the street from me, 1.5 blocks away, to dump that committed that spill. Now, if there's somebody else there, did, Console Kitchens use that stuff or something? I mean, can you tell us somebody else who's a possible source? I mean, you couldn't have possibly got all the groundwater that went under our homes for 20 years, let alone the time frame. If I spilled 20 gallons of gas up the street from you, it would have had to been out of there by now. You wouldn't be waiting 20 years. When the Blue Ox truck crashed on the highway, they made them dig out every hunk of dirt down there by the Vestal Town Hall, haul it to Rochester, $195,000 in the paper, they said, for a cleanup, and the only thing down there were 3 toads and a duck. This is under our homes, and it came from somewhere.
Yes, you're right. Okay. You're absolutely right. It is in the groundwater. It did come from somewhere. As I said, we are not here from IBM tonight to cast blame or to point fingers as to where we believe it came from. The honest answer is we don't necessarily know with certainty about all other sources. What we can tell you, and what we have told you in the interest of honesty and candor and realism, and we've told this to the mayor and trustees via the letter, and we've said it in the newsletter, is that Endicott has a rich industrial history going back decades to the turn of the century. Other enterprises besides IBM used the same chemicals. Now that's the extent of which we're going with it. We're not casting the finger or pointing blame, but we are pointing out that yes, we use
Yeah, what Mr. Richardson has elucidated here is really the nub of the credibility question about IBM, and that is, again, the #1 question the lawyers raised the other night. 4,100 gallons spilled, 60 or 70,000 gallons recovered. Where is it coming from? And IBM continues to hedge on this. They don't really want to point the finger at anybody. And we're talking about TCA here, by the way. That's the chemical that was spilled in that 4,100 gallon amount in 1979. The underground pipeline leak. TCE, which sounds similar, is actually a different chemical. It is a chemical in its own right, used, as they said, in degreasing, but it is also a breakdown product of PERC, which is a very common dry cleaning fluid used for decades. So if a dry cleaner were to spill PERC into the ground, it would naturally degrade into TCE and account for some of the TCE in the ground. So that's what makes this all so complicated, and it makes IBM unable to say with any certainty, yes or no, this is all ours, this belongs to someone or someone else. Another point to raise here is what Mario Nerci, the village engineer, has said, is that even if IBM were able to divide the pie up, they wouldn't be able to divide up the remediation effort. They'd still have to do the same thing they're doing now.
I graduated from UE in 1990. My father's doctor's office since 1962 has been at 1500 Monroe Street in downtown Endicott. I'm going to address a question to the trustees specifically because I think we've heard a lot and maybe even too much, frankly, from IBM today. And as well as the state. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of, it's interesting that the trustees are here and you're all sitting over there, almost in collusion, I might say. But that's my humble, not so humble opinion. I also heard this gentleman, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Dean Summers.
Dean. ask about a seat at the table, and I heard that IBM will merely consider that option and cannot commit to it. And so I implore the village, the trustees, to consider another option. To request or demand that IBM provide funding to the village to hire independent, neutral, and expert science team to A, evaluate the science that has been conducted under the auspices of IBM solely to date, including their friends right there. And I understand, I mean, meaning the consultants, not the state. And B, engage in continuing investigations at the IBM site itself and in the community so that residents, institutions, businesses, and landlords might have confidence in the validity of the information presented to them rather than take the word of the polluting source. So I implore the village trustees to consider that, and just, there's been a lot of talk about Superfund, and I suggest this much in the same way that Superfund makes provisions for the community to hire their own experts to check on or balance the EPA science. So this isn't a suggestion that's totally off the wall and unheard of. It's quite common, in fact.
Right. There are technical assistance grants under the Superfund program, and in fact, under the new, it's not yet passed, but the state legislation, which the Assembly and the Senate may come to terms on soon, and which the governor says he'll pass, does have actual technical assistance grants in it. But we're hoping that IBM would see the village as a constructive component to being at these discussions. I think IBM recognizes that it's the elected officials of the village who have to meet with you folks every day and hear about your concerns, and it makes perfect sense for a company to support the village to be at the table, and I would hope that the health department and DEC would share that vision as well. It's not that much a stretch to have a municipal government participating in oversight of technical work.
And in contrary to this gentleman's suggestion, it is extremely common nationwide to have the local community involved in those discussions, not just the state and the company. But I really was suggesting that IBM put aside funds for the village to seek its own science by a neutral and independent source, and not the village and the residents have to rely on the science that's provided by IBM. And if IBM really cares, then they should have no problem providing that funding.
Well, you're not just relying on the science provided by IBM. I do take some, I do have some difference of opinion. I think the folks, first of all, we sat here because this is where our name tags were. But secondly, I didn't put the name tag here. You are getting independent review of the scientific information from both the state and county governments. And we are in no way in collusion with IBM, believe me.
Next question, please.
Hi, my name's Mark Bacon. I live at 1412 North Street. Hi, my name's Mark Bacon. I live at 1412 North Street, about 40 yards away from Building 18. And my question is for the DEC. I keep hearing on the news that these vapors are not harmful to us. Why do I need a vent system?
I think this is Dan Garrity from the Department of Health. In my presentation, I touch on the point that, as kind of a practical measure, we feel that it's always a good idea to reduce your exposure to harmful chemicals. And based on that, we advised IBM that we thought it would be best if they offer these mitigation systems wherever we saw, these chemicals. We felt that the community would agree with us that, the best exposure is essentially no exposure. We did not base that on a criteria. Some particular level poses a particular health threat. It was just on the simple principle of, always working to eliminate or, reduce your exposure to these harmful chemicals.
I didn't hear anything you said there.
All right. Dan Garrity, Department of Health. As I pointed out, or tried to point out in my presentation, the the Department of Health's philosophy, and it's not necessarily a criteria, and as Mr. Balta pointed out, there are no federal criteria for indoor air levels of these chemicals.
So how can you
we heard Dan answer the first time, the PA mic wasn't working, but we heard him. So while he's talking about that again, let me just say, raise another point that Mike Nurchi, the village's engineer, raises when it comes to exposure levels. He points out that the relatively high levels agreed to in the occupational exposure levels are kind of negotiated by industry, by labor representatives, and by health concerns. They're not really an absolute number based on absolute science. They are subject to negotiation based on what is achievable, what labor will put up with, what the workers will put up with, and what the regulators are comfortable with. So when you're talking about even the standards that exist, there's really not a hard scientific background for that, according to Mike Nurchi.
So how are you going to fix that?
Mr. Bacon, in terms of your structure, if you have a stone foundation, there are ways to seal those walls, and that would have to be considered. Similarly, in your structure, as I understand, there's a significant area that you'd need a slab poured in there to create that barrier between the indoor air and the subsurface. There are ways that can be accomplished. It's more complicated, obviously, than if a house has a concrete foundation and a concrete slab, where typically in that case you just have to concern yourself with sealing the expansion joint around the perimeter. So the more openings, the more aggressive the design has to be to eliminate the vapor pathways.
Yeah, because I know it's 12,000 underneath there, you know. And when this all started out, it's 12,000 underneath there. And when this all started out, they had a little picture with the black plume, and it was 5,000 then. You know, the first time they came out with this, I think the day after you guys got out of there.
I'd be happy to speak with you either later this evening or tomorrow in detail about your particular situation and to whatever degree it takes to satisfy your concerns.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Next, please.
Good evening. My name is Kip Saracero. I reside at 524 Payton Street, Village of Endicott. My first question is directed towards the Department of Health. I'm curious to know, do you have any studies presently going on right now about cancer cases among adults in the Village of Endicott, either residing or working inside the designated area? And my second question is, based on your conclusion, your studies in April, I believe you said, you happen to find more hazardous contaminants than previously thought. Will you consider reclassifying the area to a level 2 or higher, which I believe would designate the area as a Superfund site, and which would allocate more funds towards properly cleaning up the area?
Let me have a crack at the reclassification. From the Department of Health's perspective, reclassification of Class 2 wouldn't change at all. Our activities on this project wouldn't make a health study get conducted any faster. Our involvement would be the same whether it's a Class 2, Class 4, or not even classified. I'll have Carolina talk to you about the health studies.
Hi. Current health studies you asked about in the Village of Endicott among adults in the study area you indicated? There's no current studies, and we're in a proposal stage. We want to take input from the community members, and then we'll move forth on a study.
Thank you. About reclassifying, can you touch on the Superfund? Explain to the public here the benefits of classifying that as a Superfund site.
That's essentially going to be a DEC kind of decision, the state's lead agency.
I'll direct that question to the DEC.
That's good.
Well, as of this time, we don't see that there are benefits to the reclassification. We're continuing to assess whether there would be if folks at the DEC think that there would be benefits, that it would make the project go faster or better. We'll reclassify it.
Okay. Have you considered testing the sites of Jenny F. Snap, the Kmart Plaza, or any other EJ factories while you're at it?
Yeah, I mean, to give you some insight into what our approach has been, we started in the area where we knew we had the greatest degree of contamination, and we've worked our way out. My expectation is that we won't see groundwater vapor contamination when we sample this school this summer that would be associated with the groundwater plume that we've been tracking, because we do have a clean zone that we've identified between the area of contamination and the school. In terms of the other properties, I have to look on a map with you at each of the individual properties. Clearly there are places where Endicott Johnson was a former factory presence that IBM has now purchased over a number of years, where some of these chemicals have been identified, and IBM has been cleaning them up. There may be some other places. Certainly the dump site was one. That's been something that's been addressed historically, but there may be others. I'd be happy to look at a map with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
My name is Bill Fisher, and I have property here in Endicott. And Mr. Balta, this question is addressed to IBM, but may be more properly answered perhaps by Mr. Robertson. Has IBM or its contractors at this time been able to develop either a two-dimensional or three-dimensional model of the plume that would permit it to reasonably and reliably predict whether or not there may be islands or pockets of upwellings outside of the current boundary limits? How are the limits of the plume defined in parts per billion? And is the plume now leaking into the river upstream of the South Street wells?
Greg? Yeah. Greg is the leader of the company doing the groundwater. That's why I.
Yeah, we're going to put the figure back up that had that picture in it. As I understand it, you're asking if there's a 2 or 3D model.
2 or 3D, either one.
Right, that's been developed to make predictions. And there are 2 ways to define the limits of a plume or predict where a plume is going to occur or move. One of them is by collecting empirical data, just going out and putting in a great many monitoring wells. And the other is to collect much less data than that and construct a model, as you suggest, that would try to make a prediction. In our technical area of expertise, it's far more reliable to collect a great deal of data. And as Mitch Myers mentioned earlier, IBM has installed over 200 monitoring wells that monitor groundwater conditions within and around the boundaries of the plume. So we are able to actually collect data, measure water levels, measure chemical concentrations, measure the difference in water levels in the shallow aquifer versus the deeper aquifer. And so we monitor all of those conditions and have over a great many years monitored those conditions. And we can therefore determine empirically what the limits of that plume are. We don't need to rely on modeled predictions to do that. And so that, if you see all the triangles up there, that's the current monitoring plan that's in place. And that you can see there are a great many triangles. Those are each monitoring wells that have been installed and are monitored for the purpose of defining concentrations within the plume and defining areas that are clean around the plume. So when we draw the plume boundaries, we're relying not just on measurements of concentration within the plume itself, but also outside the plume where it's clean.
Does that exclude the possibility that there will be upwellings or other plumes found outside the current boundary areas?
Outside the current boundary?
Outside the current boundary areas as depicted.
What we have here are monitoring wells that are outside the current boundary as it's measured, not predicted, as it's measured.
Okay.
And those monitoring wells show that there are not additional plumes, or that the plume that we're dealing with doesn't extend to those areas. Particularly important, as I showed before, are some of the facilities that I think folks have mentioned here tonight having a concern about, which are clearly outside the limits of the plume, as we've measured those limits, not predicted, but measured those limits. And a very important one being, of course, the South Street well field, which is well over a half a mile from the limits of the plume.
Well, the last part of that question, though, was, is the plume currently leaking into the river upstream of the South Street wells?
Yes, groundwater flow in this area of the plume extends right up to the river, and the chemicals that are dissolved in the groundwater at that point, which is at very low concentrations, do discharge to the river. Measurements in the river, samples collected from the river, show that there's no detectable level in the river because of the great volume of water in the river compared to the volume of water that's actually discharged from groundwater to the river.
But it is
Thank
going.
you.
This speaks to another point that Mario Nerci brings up. He's the village consultant. He says that these chemicals tend to be heavier than water and therefore wouldn't necessarily be detectable in the water column. If you took a sample out of the Susquehanna, they might be residing down towards the bottom.
I'm a native of this community, an alumna of Jenny F. Snap and Union Endicott High School, and sister of the one who spoke earlier, and the daughter of Dr. Emerson, whose office has been at 1500 Monroe for over 40 years. My question is for the folks from Department of Health primarily. Dr. Johnson, and I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name, the epidemiologist.
Carolina Shabsis.
Thank you. You quoted studies on TCE mainly in occupational settings, exposure studies in occupational settings, and accidental poisonings, and I do understand that the greatest body of toxicological data has been drawn from this arena historically. However, within the past 10 years, environmental regulators, toxicologists, and medical doctors, ATSTR, US EPA, Mount Sinai Medical, et cetera, are underscoring the very special vulnerabilities of young children to toxic chemical exposure that is potentially irreversible developmental effects that are seen due to prenatal and very early childhood exposures at levels much lower than the effect levels seen in adult 160-pound males. And so my question to you is, what health data are currently available to address the very different vulnerabilities of prenatal exposures in developing fetuses in young children, and if no data are available for the chemicals of concern, how will your health study affect that sort of egregious data gap?
Thank you. Okay, I can answer the first half of that. There are some studies in the scientific literature, both in animals, laboratory animals, as well as some epidemiology studies involving TCE in drinking water. And those studies suggest that the developing fetus or very young children may be more sensitive to the health effects of trichloroethane. There's some data that suggests that there, at least in animal studies, that congenital heart formations are associated with exposure to elevated levels of TCE in drinking water when they take the pregnant animals and expose them and then look for the health effect in the newly born pups. We're aware of those studies. We take that into account when evaluating these types of health situations. And again, that knowledge just underscores our philosophy to minimize exposure to the greatest extent practical. And we are aware of that, and we do take that into account.
Thank you.
Next question. I just wanted to have suggestions for the study as well. Yeah, I just wanted to address the second part of that. We're trying to evaluate congenital malformations or birth defects and other birth outcomes with the study that we proposed, and are going to be using data sources like our congenital malformations registry and birth certificate data to try to see if any of these health outcomes or health conditions that we've seen reported in the literature are evident in the community at large. So we're going to try to evaluate that. The one suggestion I would have, suggestion I would have for this study, since TCE does, as many of you said, affect central nervous system at high levels, I wonder if you might expand the health outcomes that you're looking at to include central nervous system outcomes like learning disabilities and autism. That's a very good point. The difficulties with doing that are that data about those health conditions isn't readily collected for analysis. And so that would take a special way of trying to go about collecting and evaluating that information, but we can't take that into consideration.
Thank you. Next question.
My name is Johnny Vaughn. I live on Richmond Road, which is considered partially polluted. My house is a border house, probably will be tested again at some future time, the way you're talking. But for 10 years, I lived in a house on Tracy Street. Had breast cancer surgery and treatment while living in an IBM polluted house. Mr. Boss, I'm asking you on a personal level, there's everybody in this audience has a personal story. Everybody has a personal point of view. And my personal point of view for all the people in this audience is, I don't want to live in a neighborhood that is polluted. I don't want to live in a house that is polluted. I don't want to suffer these things. What is IBM going to do for me and all these people?
Anytime somebody has a health circumstance like the one you've stated, it's very difficult. I can't begin to understand what you have gone through. When someone we know, someone we love, someone who's close to us has a health problem, it's very troubling. And we're often left to wonder why me? Why did this happen? What I can say to you is that here in Endicott, as IBM, as one company, has become aware of the existence of contaminated groundwater in Endicott, IBM has unilaterally stepped forward since 1979 to fund it and to perform it to the best of its ability. In the case of groundwater vapor intrusion, as it has come to light, again, IBM has unilaterally stepped forward to fund and undertake the work, and we are doing that work with all due haste, speed, and priority. As we identify through the Groundwater Vapor Project places where these chemicals are detected, because again, the criteria are, if detected, then ventilate. We are doing exactly that, and we are doing our level best to make those decisions and install those ventilation systems as required by this project's criteria as soon as possible. And I pledge to you that IBM will continue to execute that to the best of its ability.
Can I just add one small footnote to that? If I don't want to live there, these are my options. I can either walk away from my house because it has no value, because there is nobody willing to pay me for my house. So therefore, I don't have a place to live, and IBM has polluted it so no one else will live in it. And yet, we pay high taxes on this property that was sitting there polluted. And IBM isn't offering to help us with taxes. They're not offering to buy our houses. I mean, I think there's probably half the people here is willing to sell you our house tonight for a fair market value.
Okay. Next question, please. No, young lady, you may ask a question. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, my name's Nicole Brensko. I'm 18 years old. I grew up for 13 years on 1907 Tracy Street. I've seen the numbers, I've read the stories, I've heard them. I'm sure you have also. Our cancer rate in this town is outrageous. And when the health department was stating the numbers that it takes to cause cancer and saying that it's long-term and that our numbers are not even like really that comparable to causing cancer right now, I want to know, is there just no coincidence? I mean, I missed most of my senior year of high school at this school this past year because I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, which I'm sure you know is an environmental cancer. So I want to know if this is just no coincidence at all, because my house was not tested, the house that I grew up in. The people there were told that if they wanted that house tested, they would have to pay for it on their own. And it's probably one of the few houses on Tracy Street, as I've looked on the map in that block, that has not been tested. I really don't know where this question is going, but I just really want to know, can you really be that passive to say that we'll look into it, we'll get this questionnaire out? Because I'm terrified for my best friends to live on that street and all my other friends that live there, that they're gonna get cancer also, and I don't want anyone to have to go through what I went through this year. It's not right, and I wanna know, is it just coincidental or what's going on?
Sure. That's a very good question, and that's a question we hope to answer through this health proposal for a study. We're going to first of all try to see if the cancer rate in the area compared to the upstate cancer rates are considered to be unusually elevated, or considered to be in the normal range, or considered to be less than what would be expected in the area. So that's our first step, is to determine if these levels are out of the norm. And so that would be our first step. We're taking comments on that. How you'd like us to go about that is still up for discussion, but we'd like to take that first step. And then the second step would be, if we find an elevation, we would want to evaluate possible causes for that elevation that we see. And we can do that through many different means, including individual interviews, possibly environmental sampling or biological sampling, different questionnaires with family members, parents. So these things would be taken under consideration, but we first want to evaluate whether the cancer rate is unusual, and we would do that for all cancers, child versus adults as well, and looking at each type of cancer individually.
Okay, and I have a quick second question. I'm not really up to speed with all the high terms you guys are using. I'm really not into that. But I'm hearing everyone on the left side of the room here saying that if this was moved to a different class, like a class 2, or that nothing would be changing, how you're testing would not be, nothing would change. So what is the point for this classification at all if you're not going to do anything if it gets changed?
Well, again, as I tried to explain, if this were a Superfund lead, the classification might have some bearing on the work that was being done. It would help Superfund prioritize their sites, and it would bring it to a higher priority for Superfund, and therefore it would garner some resources that it might not otherwise do. But in this case, Superfund isn't the lead on the site. It is the RECRA program. It is our highest priority site in the state right now, and turning it into a Superfund site would not in any way make things go faster. That's just the way it is.
Well, it may show the seriousness of what we feel the problem is. You're talking about epidemiology studies. I'm a physician. They're going to take years. Meanwhile, these people are suffering probably toxic effects. You're an epidemiologist. How long is that study going to take?
It depends on the type of study that the community requests. A zip code level study usually takes approximately 18 months. When you look at a birth outcome study, it can take 1 to 2 years. If you look at a specific cancer study for a defined area that's smaller than a zip code, which this area would be if we were to look at just the area affected by this TC contamination, it could take approximately 3 years. And the reason for that delay would be that there are communities statewide requesting cancer incidence studies, which this would be considered one of those, and there's a queue. And as they come in, we process them, we do the studies, and we get them back out to the community. But the reality is there's many communities across the state that are concerned about this issue.
Let me add something to the answer about the Superfund listing. There's two lists. The numerical list that you've heard people talk about, 2 and 4. There's a state Superfund law, and it was passed in 1979. And in that law, they classify sites from the most serious being a 1, and there has never been a 1 after Love Canal, and then 2, 3, 4, and 5. And those are different classifications in terms of the status of a site for administrative purposes. So, for example, a 2 is a significant threat to human health and the environment. A 3, and I don't hold me to this, but a 3 might be remedial action taken, monitored, and then a 4 goes up to saying remedial action completed, but ongoing monitoring. They're simply classifications. It doesn't have any jurisdictional impact. It doesn't affect the DEC's ability to act. The programs, however, the Superfund program, as compared to the RCRA program, is a little different. The RCRA program is a permitting program. It operates by permit. The Superfund program is, in essence, a cleanup enforcement program. And so, although the number may not matter in terms of the authority of the department to act, the program, despite disagreements with the DEC, the program approach may be a bit different. Now that's the state level. That's called the Inactive Hazardous Waste Site Registry. There's also a federal Superfund law. And in that federal Superfund law, there's something called the National Priorities List. And each state has the ability to place certain sites on that National Priorities List. And when a site is placed on the National Priorities List, that frees up federal Superfund money to be spent. Now, the issue of funding becomes important when you don't have a potentially responsible party or a polluter who's doing the work. So IBM's point here is, if you don't need these Superfunds because we're doing the work. And so the question really becomes, if you want more work, it's whether the government is going to demand that they do more work. And IBM's response tonight is, we're doing what the government's telling us to do. So it's not really which fund, whether you're on the National Priorities List or whether you're on a Classification 2 or Classification 4 under the Inactive Hazardous Waste Site Program. It's simply a matter of what work is to be done and will IBM pay for it. If IBM does not pay for it, then you look to the funds. But at this point, IBM appears to be paying for it. So the issue tends to be, okay, well, what work do you want done? Not the number. The government could spend, they can spend money at a Class 4 site. And if they're acting, and I guess we hear the DEC here saying that they're acting as if this were a significant threat to the environment, because it would be ludicrous for them in this setting not to act as if it were a significant threat to human health and the environment. If they're acting that way, then whether or not it's a 2 or a 4 doesn't really matter given their power. So it's just a matter of the exercise of their authority. It doesn't affect it one way or the other. Does that help you at all?
Next question.
Okay.
Good evening. My name is Tony Sherling, and I live at 110 South McKinley. And my question is pretty basically to both IBM and the health department. I live in an L-shaped section to include 15 homes. In the last 10 years, there have been 7 cancer cases. Of those 7, 3 had repeat cases, one of which was my husband. 2 of the women that had repeat cases died. There were also 2 other deaths, so there was a total of 4 deaths. We've had 5 neuro disorders in a total of 4 of the houses, 1 death and 2 children born with learning disabilities, all in the same house. Of all these 15 homes, 3 of us have been told we need 2 venting systems because of the number of the area of ground to be covered. Of those 15 homes, not 1 has been tested. Can you tell me how you can blatantly say that there is no influence, cancer is not a factor, the figures are too low, when we haven't been tested? And when I asked the Board of Health after the first time my husband had the cancer, and pointed out in the initial cases, there were 7 in 3 years. And of those 7, 2 had died. I was thanked very nicely for calling and for offering the information, but we're testing for children. I am no way trying to depreciate the seriousness of children. No parent should ever have to see a child see what I saw my husband go through twice. And it was basically notify your local municipality. The last bout took place just between '02 and '03. 2 of my neighbors died. My husband was lucky enough to survive. And all I keep hearing is the levels are safe. My house has not been tested, neither is one of the 15 that have had these 10 cancer cases in 10 years. It seems to me that somebody's dropping the ball, and I don't know how or what to do about it. Just sit and pray. I get up in the morning, and if I see my husband blink, I'm worried that maybe it came back again. Bearing this in mind, I tried to refinance my mortgage to try and pay up bills we've accrued in the last year and a half of daily trips up to Syracuse. And you know what? I can't get my mortgage appraised for a high enough rate for the bank to refinance my mortgage. I started in February, and we still have not been approved for refinancing.
I'll address the first part of your question. You know, your situation, the one you're bringing to me for the first time that I've heard of it today, is the kind of thing we like to hear about. We need to hear from the community. If you have these kinds of concerns, you know, if you feel that we need to direct our efforts in a particular area, then we're here to listen to you about that. You know, I'll have Carolina talk to you a little bit about cancer, but you know, I'd like to reemphasize that, you know, we've tried to make efforts by being available to the public, and we'll increase those efforts so we can hear from you these kinds of concerns. And certainly I would need to look down and see where your address is and how it compares to the rest of the study area.
Right in the center, right down the block from me.
Okay. Well, we would have no reason to believe that, you know, what we've done is we've designed a study that we can get a sense for what's going on with homes near each other. You know, just because your house wasn't sampled, a house across the way may have been sampled, and that's what okay, and then this is what we want to hear from you if you feel that we've dropped the ball there. I'm going to have Carolina talk to you about the cancer.
Let me just add that you know, what you describe is horrific, and it's it must be a very, very terrible circumstance to have to go through. I don't personally know tonight the specifics about sampling at your exact home, but we will welcome speaking to you directly after this meeting or tomorrow, and we'll share with you the data we have and talk and try to better answer the question that you have about sampling.
And I just wanted to add, in no way do I want to belittle your concerns at all. I just want to present a little bit of information about cancer. I can understand your frustrations, and I'd be more than happy to talk with you about your concerns on a personal level, perhaps tonight or tomorrow, so I can get some more information about the cancer cases you're describing. But I think it's important that everybody in the audience know that unfortunately cancer is a very common disease, especially among the older population. 3 out of every 4 families will experience cancer. And well, I once again, I don't know all the specifics, so I don't know if this applies to your situation or not, but I think it's important information for everybody to realize. One
death was 21.
Okay, that's fine, and you know, I'm happy to get that information from you, and we can evaluate it together, and I'll get some more specifics from you, because this is the kind of information we really would like to have to see, you know, if it applies to the situation we're talking about. But I also think it's important for everybody else to know that unfortunately cancer is a pretty common disease. 1 in 3 people will experience cancer at some point in their lifetime. 3 out of every 4 families will be affected with someone with cancer in their families. And cancer is a collection of over 100 separate diseases that share a common process, and that's the rapid growth and proliferation of cells uncontrollably. And so it's very difficult to lump all of these diseases together but we can evaluate each type of cancer that you bring to us and see if there's a possible relationship between the two. So I'd be happy to talk with you on an individual basis later.
Why don't you ask the audience to raise their hands for those people that have had cancer or know people that have had cancer? Just a show of hands.
Well, I think I just, you know, I think the reality of it is that most of us know somebody who has cancer or have had cancer in their families, and it's very, very hard to deal with the personal and emotional level that cancer brings. I know my grandfather had cancer and died of it. It's quite common, but...
Okay, let's go on to the next question.
Yeah, my name is Dan Flannery. I'm out of Johnson City, New York. I lived in Endicott from 79 to 81. When I moved in, I was incredibly healthy. By the time I moved out, I was dying. And after about 3 months of being back in Binghamton, drinking their water, I went right back to normal. It was fine. First of all, I wanted to let IBM know. First of all, I want IBM people to know, and I also want the village trustees and the mayor to know that I checked with Washington. There wasn't any report filed with the EPA for the 1979 spill. That's all news to them. Secondly, that's a giant bomb right there. Most of those chemicals are made out of hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons have an explosive rate of 55 sticks of TNT per gallon. That I told them in the first meeting when I looked at that board, I told them there was 30 to 70,000 gallons, and now you just admitted to 60. As before, you were saying 17.5. This wasn't an accident. And I'll tell you something, maybe the statute of limitations has run out on you dumping this stuff. Maybe the statute of limitations has run out on you contaminating and poisoning people. But the statute of limitations of crimes against humanity or murder for the pure profit of cash, pure profit, that those statutes will never run out. And I look forward to seeing you in jail.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Dr. Larry Blyer. I have a business and been running a business on Washington Ave since 1979. I got interested in this meeting mainly because of the commercial and the property damages possibly, but I became interested from attending the meeting tonight here, just like everyone is, about the health risks. And I don't think they've really been answered, considering this has been going on for 20 years, and anyone who has a little bit background in chemistry and physics knows about chemical gradients. You have a diffusion. This started in one area and spread out, and what I'd like to know is the rate that it spread out over the 20 years. And as you write here, the likelihood of health effects associated with exposure to TCE at the measured levels in local buildings is low. Has that been shown by you unequivocally that it's been the same for the last 20 years, that the levels in all these sites around the periphery have been measured and they haven't changed? And I would tend to believe on concentration gradients that the level was highest where the accident occurred. And there was a period of a few years that those levels probably were extremely high, and you're not measuring them at this study here tonight. I'm only hearing about what's going on in the last year or two. I would love for you to give me the data for the last 20 years on all these sites, show me that the numbers have remained the same, and I would feel a little bit better for my staff and myself that have been practicing for 20 years on the Avenue. Do you have that information? Are you an MD, by the way, or what kind of doctor are you?
No, I have a PhD, but I'm not Who's
the MD on the staff there?
What's that?
Are any of you MDs?
No, but we do have a physician on staff, too.
And you have an ecologist, and you have people that are experts, like NIH, kind of people that would study epidemiologically the cancer rates, the levels of toxins that are necessary, and the time periods that are involved, and that you know and I know that it takes more than just one chemical. It takes several chemicals, can work synergistically, that will put you at risk for cancer, not the one. I mean, that's common. I mean, I'm a doctor of dentistry, and I've been trained that if you have heat, alcohol, and tobacco, nicotine is what really gives you oral cancer. So you really are doing a very basic study. I don't know what other chemicals you're looking for in that ground sampling, air sampling, and I would appreciate the data. I'll come tomorrow if you bring it to me for the last 20 years. All information, all levels of these gases, and those chemicals that were going through the solid stage in the ground. And you're going to tell me that I can feel comfortable because the levels have remained the same, they're very low. You have that evidence even tonight?
Okay, I can answer. You've thrown a lot out there, so I can answer.
Start answering. I'd appreciate it.
Portions
asking
of
what
it.
these
And I think
people probably
Bill-
want to ask. I'm here for risk levels.
Okay, and Bill can probably answer some of the questions about the hydrogeology and what might have happened to the plume historically. The estimate of a low increased risk of cancer is based on the air sampling data to date that we have, the levels that we quoted. We don't have historical sampling data of what people might have been exposed to in their homes. So that's based, if you took, for instance, the 140 micrograms per cubic meter and calculated what we call a cancer risk estimate based on an estimate of how carcinogenic trichloroethylene is and estimates of what the exposure probably is, we would come up with a number that we would classify as a low increased risk of cancer, which means it's below or around 1 in 10,000, okay, compared to the background rate of cancer. That's something that you probably can't even detect. With respect to the mixtures of chemicals, the chemical that's been detected most often and at the highest levels is trichloroethylene. Our estimation is that if we remediate that and if we minimize exposure to that, we'll be doing that for the rest of the chemicals. I mean, there are other chemicals involved. They tend to be detected less frequently and at lower levels, but if we take care of the trichloroethylene, that's really what's driving the risk here. That's what's driving the concern. So that's why our focus is with that one chemical. But your point's well taken about the additivity and possible, synergistic or greater than additive effect of chemicals, and we have considered that as well.
Do you think there were higher concentration levels, let's say, closer to the site than there is to the high school here at any period? I mean, this is kind of spread out, and maybe at its lowest level now. Is that plume receding and getting smaller?
That's something that Bill can probably
We have data, groundwater monitoring data that goes back to the late 70s, and we can make that available. It's all at the DEC. If you looked at the last 10 years or so, I'd say the overall concentration of chemicals that are being removed from the plume off the factory site itself has probably gone down by about 25%. That's based, I just did a kind of an estimate of what the loading was coming out of their pumping system and compared that over time. 10 years ago, in other words, the concentrations were probably somewhat higher in the core area of the plume than they are now. And you could kind of ballpark estimate what the vapor concentrations might have been by correlating what they are in different places now.
Would that be of help information to the medical group over there in determining risk factors for cancer and other morbidity and more type of illnesses? If you gave them that information, you told them that it was at certain
we have
levels?
all of that information. We have all the same data that the DEC has, and that's certainly one of the options depending on the direction that we go in the health study. We do have 2 decades worth of groundwater data. We actually have quite a wealth of environmental sampling data in the past for this project. So that is something that we would consider in our study.
The other question I have, and I wasn't going to ask it, but people are asking one question, and I'll stop it, is the ventilation systems. Does that bring fresh air from the outside, or is that just circulating air from downstairs and tending to pull in air, which the contaminants, into the building?
Actually, what it does, it depressurizes the soil gas from beneath the slab of the bottom of your basement, so it creates a negative pressure. It actually would tend to pull air from the basement, small amounts of it, down to the suction points, and then the chimneys that are attached to that fan, it vents that gas up through the chimney and out, up by the roof.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, my name is James Gilkison. I live on 6th Don Street in Kirkwood, New York. I also have a piece of property in Milan Ave up in Endicott. I represent Builders America, which is my company. I'm the owner, and most of my work is in air and water purification. And one of the biggest things we're doing to ourselves in these days is locking ourselves in a vacuum in our homes with the magnetic seals on the doors and the double pane windows and the Tyvek on the house. We have no idea what we're doing to ourselves, not only the chemicals that we're talking about here that are coming into our homes, but we're actually making ourselves sick in other ways that we have no idea what we're doing. I use ozone, and Mr. Whalen, I'm the guy that sent you all that stuff. We looked it up, and the company looked it up and said trichloroethylene, the main ingredient that's causing the problem, that this ozone, which when sunlight goes through the air or when lightning strikes the earth, God used it to bring it to the earth, to cleanse it, to dissipate or break down these toxic chemicals that infiltrate our environment. So now a scientist has made a way to make a machine to induce ozone into your house and create an environment the way God intended it to be inside your homes. I wanted to know if IBM would be willing to take one of these machines, put it in a known environment, and let it run, because I've only got test data on 3 of the chemicals, vinyl chloride and this long name I don't want to even pronounce and embarrass myself. I would like to work with you and just install one in there and see if it doesn't take care of it. The other thing I'm concerned about is that this vacuum that we're creating in the basement is taking care of the odors that are coming up through the house. But what about what's seeping out of the ground, coming in through the windows and doors when we lock ourselves in at night? Are we really taking care of the problem totally because the basement door is shut and we think we've got the problem taken care of downstairs, but we've just come in and brought another piece of the environment in and we're locking the doors again and creating this environment. So I just want to offer up the fact that this technology does exist, and will IBM allow me to stick one of these machines in a known environment and let's see what it does.
Thank you very much for telling us more further about the technology you've got. We're always open at IBM to different technologies, different solutions. Please do follow up directly with Kevin. We'll evaluate not just your suggestions, but others that come forward. You do make a point about today's modern built environment. One other point that I will mention solely for the purpose of understanding is that in the vast majority of homes that we're testing, there were found to be contributions to VOCs from sources inside the home. That is simply a statement of fact about the environment we all live in. I do not say that for the purpose of suggesting that IBM won't do ventilation at such a place. I only raise that for honest education.
All right, the next question.
Hi, my name is Betty Havel. I live on Arthur Avenue. I have a ventilated home. I'm also part of a citizens action group, and I'm running for trustee also just so I can continue to be involved with this. My question goes back to Mr. Summers. I'm looking for an answer to his question about the soil. This was spilled into the soil. I know that in the Brockport, where they had their spill, that there were, I think the gentleman told me, 800 tractor trailers of soil were removed from the site. And I'm just wondering, did IBM do anything like that? I mean, was there any soil removed to take out of this site where this spill happened?
At least based on my review of the records that we have from the 79 spill, there is information in there that yes, material was dug up and removed. I don't have the quantity information to give you tonight, but the very direct question to your answer is yes.
Was it taken to a secure site? Because I know that theirs was transported to a secure site. Was this soil transported just to another site within our community? Where there's a possibility that other people can be contaminated? Or why wasn't more soil? Or are you looking into removing more soil at this time? Even if we're still pumping all of this out of the groundwater, then there's still a source. If there's still a lot of contaminated soil, couldn't that removal speed this process up?
Yeah, at this point, we're not looking at digging more soil, but the part of the study that we've talked about earlier to evaluate groundwater remediation options and enhancements that could be done will certainly, take that possibility into consideration. But as far as the disposal of the material in 79, I don't have specific recollection to and I'm not sure that the information is the file, but I can check if you want to check with me tomorrow.
Okay.
I would have to do some additional research about the disposal site. At that point, you know,
Yeah, I think
I
that's
can only
something
say
people need to
typically
know.
it would have gone to a controlled landfill, I would say typically. But to this specific instance, I don't have an answer for you tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Susan Brooks, and I live on North Rogers Avenue. I just have a couple of comments rather than questions. I think after hearing some of these stories, this meeting is about 20 years overdue. I believe that IBM, for years, has been treated with kid gloves by our public officials, by some of our state and local officials, because they feared that IBM might leave. We mustn't anger IBM because they might leave. Well, they did leave, and they left behind a big mess. You tell us that you care about us. That was number one on your list of points that we should remember. I believe that you care about us, but I believe that's irrelevant now. We really want this cleaned up as quickly as possible. And one more comment. I found some old newspaper clippings, and the former health commissioner, Dr. Schechter, said in 1980 that it would take 38 to 40 years for this to reach our wells, our drinking water. What is your assessment now? I mean, we have 15 years left. Is that what we have to wait for?
If the question is, other than the comment, if the question is, when is contaminated groundwater from the plumes IBM is remediating going to reach the South Street drinking water wells?
Well, he didn't say
I have said
South
tonight
Street.
that has not happened. And the remediation system has been designed, and there are data available to demonstrate that has not happened. So as far as the contamination we're addressing, that hasn't happened. And it won't take X years to happen because it won't happen. We will prevent that from happening as we have done to
It
date.
won't happen. I can quote you on that?
Yes.
It will not happen.
I'll say it again.
Okay.
Contaminants from the remediation that IBM is addressing is not reaching the South Street drinking water wells, and the programs and controls we're putting in place are designed to prevent that from happening. That has been a fundamental goal since the beginning, and it remains to this day.
And I do have a question, another question. Have there been any other spills that we don't know about since 1979?
Since 1979,
Yes.
Other spills per se.
Other
I am
spills,
certain-
dumping, you know,
I
whatever.
suspect that there are a handful, and a handful I mean 6, instances of reportable releases to the environment. Now, whether those reportable releases were chemical spills or not is another matter. We would be happy to make available on the public record every reportable incident that IBM, as one company operating in Endicott,
Right, that's all
has
we're
experienced.
talking about
I
IBM.
have absolutely no reticence to do that whatsoever.
Okay,
But
because they've been
again,
quiet for
it's
23
important to
years.
understand that the village of Endicott has a very rich industrial heritage.
Right, but we're just
And
focusing on
if you're interested in
IBM.
reportable releases and spills, yes, and you have the ability to focus on just IBM, by the way, because we at IBM, in response to your issue about leaving, have unilaterally since 1979 funded and performed the remediation of contaminated groundwater, even though we have known all these years that we were not the only source. That is consistent with our commitment to you, which I did say tonight, that we are not leaving, we still care, and we are going to
Okay.
continue to do the work.
And we're watching.
You are indeed, and you should be, and we'll continue to enable that.
I'll clarify one point. There have been trace chemicals detected in our South Street water source. Yes. We don't know, they are not, we don't know the origin of them, and they're probably breakdown products from something else. We're not sure. But I think that was even reported on the information the water department sends out, that we would like to know the source of the trace chemicals. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. My name is Bernadette Patrick. I'm a resident of Endicott, and the young lady that spoke earlier who lost part of her senior year at this school is my daughter. So now you know why I'm standing here. My other passion is the community itself. I've lived here my whole life. My family, my roots are here, very strong roots. My mother was a devoted employee of IBM. They treated her well. She treated them well. So the reason I'm here is to speak for the community, and I'm wondering, and my question is to IBM. I've already beat the DEC and the Department of Health up today, so I'll leave them alone. I'm wondering if in your meetings, behind your closed doors, if you feel, and if there's been any talk amongst yourselves that you feel you need to do anything more for this community other than putting ventilation systems in our homes. The couple who had their home up for sale because they were going to move into a retirement community and now cannot do that, and now they don't know what to do. Do you owe them any more than what you're already giving them? Or do you think you owe us any more than what you're doing for us right now? And if you don't, and if your sense is that, and I've heard you say this evening, that this is a heavily industrial area, and if your feeling is that it's a risk you take if you're going to live in an area near industry. If the latter is true, then I think we would all be very hard-pressed to ever again allow the state of New York to bring another industry into our neighborhood. Because you're putting us at risk, and we can't afford it anymore. The tax burden and everything else that it's put on us, we cannot afford it. So I'm just wondering if you feel that you need to go beyond what you've done to compensate the community.
In response to your question about whether my personally saying that Endicott has a rich industrial heritage, if one of your questions is whether I'm saying that that's a risk people take, no, that's not at all what I am saying. The sole purpose of saying that Endicott has a rich industrial heritage is to help this community understand historically that there have been many enterprises, in addition to IBM, we are one. There have been many before, during, and perhaps after IBM that have used many of these same chemicals. That is the purpose of me saying that. It is not intended to say that it's a risk someone should have to live with. In response to your question about IBM doing more than we are doing to date, the answer to your question is that what we are doing right now in terms of unilaterally handling the groundwater vapor project, and as best we can and as quickly as we can, providing ventilation systems at places where the chemicals have been detected in whatever amount according to the project criteria. That is exactly what we are performing right now. Beyond that, your question would assume that IBM somehow is solely accountable for other matters, and we have not had those deliberations.
You're only ventilating the homes that you are responsible for, as I understand it, that you're claiming that you have been charged to by the DEC. So in those homes, those property values have decreased. Who's compensating these people for their loss?
Our view on property value is a view that you may not like, but I need to tell you what it is in the interest of honesty, openness, and candor. As we install the ventilation systems on homes where there have been a detection of any of the chemicals in any amount by the laboratory equipment, that installation thereby stops and prevents any additional movement into the home from the groundwater. Now, there may remain chemicals in the home from other sources. As I mentioned earlier, in virtually every place we sampled, we found indications of chemicals within the home from other sources. It's part of our daily lives. But the installation systems that we're putting in will prevent that from occurring. That's the direct, honest answer to your question.
Bernadette,
You're right, I didn't
Eastman
like it.
Kodak, what Eastman Kodak did was they attempted to guarantee people's property values so that they arranged a program whereby you would have the home assessed without the contaminant being taken into account, and then the house would be put on the market by realtors that Kodak had, as I recall, that Kodak had selected. And then, depending upon the sale price as compared to the appraisal, Kodak would make up the difference. Then what Kodak did, however, was to try to get people to stay in the community rather than to leave, because there is literature that supports property values restoring themselves after a number of years after abatement takes place. And so they provided grants and very low interest loans. Nowadays with mortgage rates, it's already low, but they provided grants and very low interest loans for people to make investments to add to their homes to try to enhance the community and encourage people to stay. I think the village is going to be raising this value protection plan with the state and with IBM, because it is the one way to, I think, get people to stop having anxiety over the impact on property values, because as long as the cleanup takes place, whether or not there's a technology installed in a home that removes the chemical, the fact is the installed technology remains in the home and may impair the value. So the village is going to continue discussing this value protection plan. Other companies have implemented it in a number of areas. I just mentioned Kodak because it's Rochester's relatively close.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, my name's Ed Blaine. I raised my family at 10 Jackson Avenue. And I heard IBM say tonight that they're responsible only for 4,000 gallons of trichloroethane in the groundwater. And I believe at this date, over 70,000 gallons of contaminants have been pumped out of the groundwater. And a lack of curiosity about where the other 66,000 gallons of contaminants came from is astounding. Our house, among the chemicals found in our house, and we have a ventilation system already installed, is tetrachloroethane in a very high amount, and an extremely high amount underneath the house. And in your literature that you sent out, you're claiming that you're not the source of that contaminant. And my question is, and I know that that's used in dry cleaners, but in some of our own investigation found out that most of the dry cleaners in the Endicott area don't actually dry clean their clothes here. They send it out to be dry cleaned. So the amount of dry cleaners really doesn't have a whole lot to do with the amount of perc in the groundwater as a contaminant. My question is, because I am curious about where those contaminants came from, because it's in my house, and my kids have grown up breathing that contaminant. And so I would like to know, is anybody doing any research and investigation at all to find out where all these other contaminants that IBM is not responsible for, how they got into the groundwater, if for no other reason to make sure they're not still going into the groundwater? I mean, the lack of curiosity about that really astounds me. We're responsible for 4,000 or other industries. We don't really care about how it got there. I care about how it got there. I think other people care about how it got there. Is anybody trying to figure out how it got there? How much is IBM responsible for, other than IBM saying we're responsible for this amount? What investigation is going on to find out what got there from whom and who's responsible for the amounts that are in our groundwater?
Let me offer a first comment on that and then turn it over to the fellow from the Department of Environmental Conservation. Please don't misunderstand me. Okay, I, on behalf of IBM, have not said that IBM is responsible for 4,100 gallons of TCA. Okay, what I have said is that we know of a documented release of 4,100 gallons of TCA. And we've described to you how it's been cleaned up. There's been some question about that. We'll provide all the information we have about it to the public so you can know more about that. What I've also said is that What we do know is that chemical handling practices of prior decades across industry are clearly not what we now all wish they had been. You mentioned that the use of the fact that dry cleaners don't clean dry clothes on site today makes the presence of perchloroethylene in dry cleaners irrelevant. I'm sorry, sir, but that's not correct.
I didn't say
Many
irrelevant.
dry
I said it doesn't
cleaners,
answer the whole
many dry cleaners in this community use perchloroethylene on site in years gone by. In the village of Endicott, there have been 26 dry cleaners within the area historically. That is a very large density of dry cleaners. You also might know that perchloroethylene over time has the ability to break down into TCE. So in the interest of accuracy, it's essential for me to help people realize that the role of dry cleaners in your community could indeed be a factor that is worthy of consideration. We did, as we said in our project newsletter, in this entire project that IBM has undertaken since June, the single highest detection of any chemical in any place tested occurred at a location where IBM was clearly not the source. It was perchloroethylene. It was 1,800 micrograms per cubic meter. Dry cleaning is the likely source. Those are the honest facts, sir. I'm not trying to shrink away from any IBM responsibility whatsoever, but what I am trying to do is to help people understand the entirety of the matter in the village of Endicott.
So nobody's looking for the source.
Well,
Is that the
no,
answer?
let me add to that, because people are looking for the source, and there are really two pieces. One is the IBM piece, and to be quite honest, IBM, I think, is like virtually all other industries in the country, and Wayne alluded to it, but I'll make it a bit more explicit. There were thousands and thousands, millions of gallons probably of these chemicals used over a number of years at this industrial facility as well as at the EJ facility and others. And, you know, it only takes a small percentage of the amount that were used to be spilled or dripped or leaked a little bit undetected or even unconcerned in the 1950s or 60s or even in the early 70s. You know, the standard industry practice was, by today's standard, abhorrent, okay? But people did things then that we don't do now. And so there is no real surprise that you find a lot more chemicals in the ground than you thought happened from one spill, because there probably were many spills of varying sizes. And there's just no way, there was no historical documentation to really elucidate, you know, where and how many. So that, you know, we just assume if there's contamination present in the vicinity of IBM property and it links back to IBM, that it's IBM's responsibility. That's piece one. The other piece is there are, as we've gone forward with this investigation, there are a number of places, and some of the maps that IBM has provided or will provide tomorrow, you can identify some hotspots that kind of stand out. PERC is kind of the biggest one. And you can see, basically, if you look in Jefferson Avenue from there to the west, the relative abundance of PERC is much greater than the abundance of TCE or TCA. And you see places where, you know, it's not so hot, and then it gets hot, and then it gets less hot. Those almost certainly represent additional sources, not exclusively IBM types of sources, and the DEC is actively pursuing those sources. We've had some preliminary discussions with one potential source in the area. We have, in fact, some conference calls scheduled internally later this week to kind of go over that map and you know, prioritize further investigations of some of these other sources. We're just, you know, we're just really at the beginning of that process, because it's really this last round of data, the phase 3 data, where we've gone kind of, we're at the fringe of what we thought to be the IBM problem, and as we got to the fringe of it, we discovered some additional problems.
Next question.
My name's Roy Lackner, City of Binghamton. I had a couple points that I'd like to make with the few of the gentlemen that are on the board here. As we all know, trichloroethylene mysteriously shows up in our well water. It's a standard addition to the report that comes from every city water department, as I'm sure the gentleman from the water department of Endicott can testify that trichloroethylene is a part of your drinking water and has been in the past. The gentleman from the DEC, and I believe that was IBM's hydrology map that we were looking at and not your own. Obviously, that was very misleading as far as the way the groundwater acts in this area. As a graduate of Cornell University in soil science and working in the construction trade, I have a fairly good
I'm Steve Craig,
understanding
News
of
Channel
the
34. We are about to conclude our 3.5-hour look into a pivotal evening in the life of a community, Endicott, New York, as village residents, village leaders, leaders of industry, and state regulators grapple with some of the environmental and health concerns brought to them by the village after the discovery back in 1979 of a certain chemical spill that led to the discovery of other chemicals underground, and then most recently chemicals wafting up from underground into people's homes in very tiny amounts, but still enough to be alarming. To sum up, the village wants the following. They want a seat at the table along with the DEC and IBM as the management of the situation continues down the road. They also want a value protection plan so that people's property will be worth what it would be worth were there not chemicals beneath the ground. They also want Superfund status instead of consideration under the RCRA law, which has been the case for 20 years. Superfund considered a bit more victim-friendly, not polluter-friendly. IBM says that 85 to 95% of the affected properties have been identified. They will be vented. They will retest 10 to 15% to see if the air is cleaner, and they will investigate more groundwater remediation to shrink the size of the plume. Now that the thrust has shifted from protecting the South Street wells, which has been achieved, they say, for 20 years, now it is to get the stuff out of the ground so that there are no more vapors coming up under people's houses. The State Department of Health will look at cancer registry numbers and birth certificates to see if there is a health effect, but can't promise any conclusive results. And the DEC says that IBM has been done what it was told, and that reclassifying the site won't make a difference in what actually happens. We're going to take a break and come back with the 11 o'clock news. Thanks for watching. This has been continuing coverage on News Channel 34 of the Endicott toxic plume.